I remember the first time I decided to rent a cabin alone deep in the forest. I had been working long hours in the city, feeling exhausted and disconnected, and the idea of complete isolation appealed to me. I found a small wooden cabin listed online, located several miles from the nearest road, surrounded by thick pines and a small creek running nearby. The photos made it look cozy, rustic, and untouched, with a wood-burning stove and a porch that overlooked the trees. I thought it would be the perfect place to rest, think, and get away from the constant noise of everyday life. The drive there was long and rough. The GPS barely worked past the main highway, and I ended up following narrow dirt tracks, sometimes disappearing completely under overgrown branches. By the time I reached the last turn before the cabin, the sun was beginning to set, the forest casting long shadows over the road. The cabin itself was smaller than I expected, but it was solid. Its wood had aged darkly, with moss creeping along the sides and the roof covered in a thin layer of pine needles. There was a small cleared area in front, just enough space for a single car, and behind it, the trees were so dense that it felt like the forest went on forever. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of damp wood and old smoke. Dust covered the corners, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. It was basic, no internet, a small fridge, a wood stove, and a narrow bed pushed against the wall. I felt a sense of relief. This was exactly what I had come for. Silence, solitude, and a break from everything. I unpacked my things slowly, trying to savor the quiet, and then stepped onto the porch. The sky was a deep orange as the last rays of the sun slid between the trees. The creek behind the cabin murmured softly, and for a moment, I felt completely at peace. Night came quickly. Once the sun disappeared, the forest turned completely black, broken only by the weak glow of a small lantern I had brought. I lit the wood stove, enjoying the warmth, and sat quietly, listening. The sounds of the forest were alive. Branches snapping under the weight of animals, the occasional rustle of leaves, and far away, the cry of an owl. I read a book for a while, drinking hot tea, and eventually fell asleep, feeling relaxed and safe. The next day, I woke early. I had planned to hike along a trail I had seen on the map that led to a small waterfall several miles away. The air was crisp, and the sunlight made the dew on the trees sparkle. I packed water, some food, and my camera, thinking I could spend the day exploring and return before dark. The hike began well enough. The path was narrow and overgrown, but it was clearly used by hikers occasionally. Birds flitted from branch to branch, and I even spotted a deer grazing at the edge of a clearing. After a couple of hours, I noticed the trail becoming less maintained. The forest grew denser, and the path narrowed to barely more than a strip of dirt. I brushed branches away as I walked and paid attention to the sounds around me. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The trail was littered with footprints, but they didn't look like deer or other animals. They were human, large, boot-shaped prints pressed deep into the dirt. I paused, my heart thumping. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail. Maybe a hunter or a hiker had passed through recently, I thought, trying to calm myself. But something about the prints felt deliberate, almost like someone had been watching me. I considered turning back, but curiosity got the better of me. I followed the footprints cautiously. They led away from the waterfall I had intended to reach and deeper into the forest. The air grew heavier and the shadows longer. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that the forest always made people uneasy, that my imagination was running wild. Then I saw something that made me stop dead. A small campsite, crudely built, hidden in a cluster of trees. The fire pit had cold ashes, and around it, pieces of old, worn clothing were scattered. It looked abandoned, but it was clear someone had been there recently. My mind raced. I didn't want to be in the forest with someone who might not welcome my presence. I turned to leave, but then I realized the footprints around the campsite didn't just stop. They led in a circle, and then they seemed to vanish. No clear path back to the main trail. My stomach sank. I had ventured further than I realized, and now I was in a part of the forest I had no knowledge of. I decided I had to retrace my steps carefully. Hours passed. I walked slowly, scanning the ground, trying to find familiar markers. The sun started dropping behind the trees, and the forest grew colder. Shadows stretched unnaturally, and the sounds of the forest seemed louder, sharper, almost like they were following me. Then I heard it. A snapping branch, a deliberate step behind me. I froze, my pulse racing. I could hear nothing else for a few tense moments, then a rustle again, closer this time. My mind screamed at me to run. I turned and sprinted down the path I thought was the way back. Panic set in as I realized I had lost the trail. The trees all looked the same, the dense underbrush slowing me down. My breathing came in short, harsh bursts. The sun was almost gone, and I could barely see. I stumbled over roots, scraped my arms on branches, and my clothes were soaked with sweat. Then I heard it again, a clear sound of footsteps following mine, deliberately keeping pace. My mind raced through possibilities. A lost hiker, a hunter, someone dangerous. I had no way to know, and that uncertainty made it worse. I ran blindly, desperate to get back to the cabin. Hours seemed to pass. The forest was now fully dark, and the cold had settled into my bones. I fell at one point and rolled down a small incline, scraping my knees and elbows, but I forced myself to get up and keep moving. Finally, in the far distance, I saw a small flicker of light. I ran toward it, hope surging. As I got closer, I recognized it, the faint glow of my cabin through the trees. Relief hit me like a wave. I staggered into the clearing, collapsed against the cabin wall, and gasped for air. I was safe, but exhausted, scared, and shaken to my core. That night, I stayed inside the cabin, keeping the lantern and stove lit. I double-checked all the locks and secured the windows as best as I could. Every sound outside made me tense, but I refused to leave the cabin until morning. Sleep came fitfully, with dreams full of footsteps and shadowy shapes. The next morning, I explored the cabin grounds and nearby creek more thoroughly. I noticed fresh footprints in the mud leading from the forest toward the cabin, then stopping short of the porch. Whoever had been out there had come close, perhaps even watched me the night before, but had left without confronting me. I packed my things carefully, making sure to lock the cabin and leave it exactly as I found it, then drove back toward the main road as quickly as I could. After that trip, I realized the forest was not a friendly place for total isolation, at least not without knowing the area extremely well. There were people living in parts of the forest, hidden, watching, and sometimes those people could be dangerous without warning. I returned to the city, shaken but grateful to be safe. The experience left me cautious about venturing into remote areas alone. I never forgot the sound of footsteps in the dark, or the sight of those scattered clothes in the hidden campsite. It stayed with me, a reminder that solitude in the wilderness carries risks far beyond the natural world. Eventually, I started hiking again, but only in well-populated, marked trails. I brought a friend or two each time and made sure to carry communication devices. The forest was beautiful, but the memory of that cabin and the unseen presence in the woods was always there, a silent lesson about respect, caution, and awareness. I had survived, and I had learned, and that knowledge gave me a strange sense of empowerment. The fear never fully left, but it transformed into vigilance, which became my way of keeping safe in places that can so easily overwhelm the unprepared. I never thought I would find myself alone in a cabin so deep in the forest that even the faintest sound of civilization seemed impossible to reach. I had been planning this trip for weeks, looking for solitude, a break from the city, the constant noise, the endless faces, and the endless responsibilities that made every day feel heavier than the one before. I found the cabin online, a listing buried in the middle of some obscure website. It promised complete isolation, a little wooden structure in the middle of a dense forest in northern Maine, surrounded by pine trees, a small stream, and no one for miles. It seemed perfect. Too perfect, perhaps, but at the time I didn't care. I arrived in the early afternoon, the sun warm on my skin but already leaning west, casting long shadows between the trunks of trees. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ache if you stay still too long. The only sounds were my boots crunching on the dirt trail and the occasional rustle of something moving in the underbrush. The cabin itself was small, made of rough-hewn logs with a peaked roof and a thin chimney. Smoke curled faintly from it, though it was cold enough that I would need a fire soon. The door creaked when I opened it, and the inside smelled faintly of pine and damp earth. Inside, it was simple. A small living area with a table and 2 chairs, a wood stove, a single bed pushed into a corner, and a small shelf with cooking utensils. There was a small bathroom, a water pump in the corner that connected to the stream outside, and a window that framed the forest like a painting. I set my bag down, unpacked a few things, and decided to go for a short walk to stretch my legs. I needed to see my surroundings. The forest was thicker than I expected. The trees tall and close, their trunks twisting and nodding in strange ways. The undergrowth was dense in some places, low shrubs and ferns making the ground uneven. I followed a narrow trail along the stream, the water moving fast over smooth stones, clear enough to see small fish darting under the surface. The sun dropped lower, and I realized how quickly darkness would arrive. I made a mental note to return before nightfall. When I got back, I started a fire in the stove. The sound of crackling logs was comforting, a small barrier against the looming silence outside. I cooked a simple meal, the smell of fried eggs and bacon filling the cabin, and sat staring into the fire for longer than I intended. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and bend, and for a moment, I felt the first stirrings of unease. Not fear, not yet, but a subtle awareness that I was alone, entirely alone, and that in such isolation, even small noises could feel enormous. Night came quickly. The darkness outside pressed against the windows like a living thing. The wind picked up, rattling branches and shaking the cabin slightly. At first, it was just the usual sounds of the forest, the creak of trees bending, the rustle of leaves. But soon, I started hearing things I couldn't immediately place. A snapping of a twig far off in the woods, something heavy moving over the undergrowth. My mind tried to rationalize, but the rationalizations came slower, less convincing, each one shadowed by the raw, immediate sense of being watched. I checked the doors and windows, making sure they were locked and latched. The locks were old, simple, but sturdy. I felt safer knowing that. Still, sleep did not come. The wind howled outside, the cabin groaning under the pressure of the cold night air. Every time the floor creaked beneath me, I jumped. My nerves were frayed by the relentless darkness pressing against the thin walls. I kept the fire going, telling myself that as long as the flames burned, I was safe. Around midnight, I heard it. A scraping sound, slow and deliberate, coming from outside. First, I froze, listening. It stopped. My heart was pounding in my chest. I crept to the window, just peeking through the curtain. The moon had come out, casting pale light over the forest floor. I could see the trees, the stream, the rocks, but nothing else. The sound had stopped. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or a raccoon, something normal, but the unease did not go away. I tried to sleep, but every noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. I kept the fire burning low, watching the flames. Then I heard it again, the scratching, closer this time. Not from the trees, not from the forest floor, but from the side of the cabin. My stomach dropped. I could see the faint outline of the cabin in the moonlight, and there, just at the edge of the shadows, something moved. Not a human, not quite a deer, but something large. My mind raced with possibilities. A bear? Too cautious, too deliberate. Someone else? Impossible, but what if it wasn't? I remembered the axe I had brought from home. I grabbed it, holding it tightly. My breathing was loud in my ears. I considered opening the door, stepping outside, checking, but something told me that would be a mistake. The scratching continued intermittently, each sound making my heart lurch. The night stretched endlessly. Hours seemed to pass, each minute heavy, each sound amplified. Eventually, just before dawn, the sound stopped. The forest fell silent again. I stayed awake, sitting by the fire, not daring to sleep until the sun's rays began to filter through the window. When light finally came, I cautiously opened the door, axe in hand. The ground around the cabin was disturbed. Footprints, large, uneven, unlike any animal I knew, circled the cabin. Marks on the walls suggested something had been trying to get inside, maybe climbing, maybe scratching. I realized then that I had been lucky. The presence outside had been persistent but not aggressive enough to force an entry. Whoever, or whatever, was out there had tested the cabin's defenses and then left, perhaps deterred by the fire or my own presence. The realization brought a deep relief, but also a sharp understanding. The forest was not empty, and isolation came with real danger, not imaginary. I spent the rest of the day preparing. I reinforced the door, nailed boards over the windows temporarily, and checked all the latches. I gathered firewood in large quantities, enough to last me for days if necessary. I made a plan. If I ever heard sounds like that again, I would stay inside, secure myself, and wait for daylight. The idea of leaving the cabin alone, into the forest, felt reckless and dangerous. The following night was tense but uneventful. I kept the fire going, slept in short bursts, and remained alert. By the third day, I had adjusted somewhat, understanding that the noises I had heard were part of life in the wilderness. Predators, other humans, the constant movement of the natural world. But the memory of that first night lingered like a weight on my chest. I stayed cautious, never letting my guard down. By the end of the week, I had grown accustomed to the rhythms of the forest. I moved with care, avoiding certain areas at night, making sure the cabin remained a secure base. I explored the surrounding area cautiously during daylight, learning the terrain, identifying safe spots and potential dangers. Every time I returned to the cabin, I felt a mixture of relief and pride for having survived in such raw isolation. When it was time to leave, I packed my things carefully, checked the cabin one last time, and took the trail back to the road. The forest was quiet, beautiful, and endlessly dangerous. Driving back to civilization, I thought about how close I had come to disaster simply by underestimating the wilderness. The experience had changed me. I had faced real fear, real isolation, and real vulnerability, and I had survived by staying calm, alert, and cautious. The memory of that first night stayed with me for years. The sound of the scratching at the cabin walls, the darkness pressing in from all sides, the knowledge that I was utterly alone. But it also stayed as a lesson in preparation, awareness, and respect for nature. The forest had tested me, and I had passed, not because of luck, but because I had acted carefully, planned ahead, and faced fear without panicking. The cabin had been scary, the nights long, and the uncertainty real, but I had left safely, stronger and wiser for having endured it. I still remember the sound of that first night, and I always will, but it no longer terrifies me. Instead, it reminds me that the world is bigger and stranger than my everyday life, that danger can exist in quiet, unexpected forms, and that facing it with attention and caution is the only way to come through unscathed. I don't seek isolation often, but I know now that I can survive it. The forest, the cabin, the long, dark nights. They are part of life, part of the real, living world, and surviving them is something I will never forget. I had been planning this cabin trip for months. I needed to get away from everything: work, the city, the noise, the constant demands. I had grown tired of people, tired of the constant hum of life that never seemed to let up. The idea of spending a week alone in a cabin deep in the mountains, surrounded only by trees and the occasional sound of wildlife, felt like a lifeline. I found a small, secluded cabin for rent online. It wasn't fancy. It was old and wooden, but it had everything I needed: a stove, a bed, a shower, and enough space to feel alone. It was also miles away from the nearest town. No cell service, no internet, nothing. Exactly what I wanted. The drive there was long. I left early in the morning with a backpack full of food, water, blankets, and some extra supplies just in case. The first part of the journey was easy, driving on paved roads. But eventually, the pavement ended, replaced by a narrow dirt road that twisted and turned between dense trees. The trees were tall and thick, casting shadows even though it was early. I remember thinking the forest felt alive in a way that was almost oppressive. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, turning the sky orange and pink. The cabin looked even smaller than the pictures online, but there was a charm to it. It was built from dark, weathered logs, and the roof had a layer of moss growing on it. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and a smell of old wood and dust filled the air. I dropped my backpack by the door and immediately noticed how quiet it was. There was no wind, no birds, nothing. Just silence. I spent the first hour exploring. The cabin had a small living room with a fireplace, a kitchen that was almost bare, a bedroom with a mattress on the floor, and a tiny bathroom. I checked everything carefully, making sure the doors and windows locked. All the locks worked, but they looked old. One window in the bedroom had a crack in the glass, and I considered covering it with tape to make it more secure. I started a fire in the fireplace. The sound of the logs crackling was comforting. I heated up some kin soup and sat on the floor near the fire, watching the shadows dance along the walls. Outside, the forest had grown dark, and I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves. I reminded myself that it was probably just animals, squirrels, deer, maybe a fox. Still, I felt a little uneasy. The isolation I had craved now felt heavy, almost suffocating. As the night deepened, the sounds from outside became louder. Branches snapped, leaves rustled, and there were moments when I could swear I heard footsteps. My mind tried to rationalize it. I told myself animals made those noises. I checked the locks again. Everything was secure. I sat by the fire, trying to relax, but sleep didn't come easily. Every small sound made me jump, my heart pounding in my chest. The first morning, I woke to an eerie quiet, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural. No birds, no wind, nothing. I stepped outside to stretch and noticed the forest around me. It was dense, unbroken, and silent. My car was parked a little way from the cabin, and I walked over to make sure it was fine. Nothing seemed wrong. I breathed in the cold, sharp mountain air and tried to push away the unease I felt. I spent the day exploring the area around the cabin. There was a small stream a few hundred meters away, some trails that looked like animals had made, and dense forest stretching in every direction. I found firewood and stacked it near the cabin, checking the stove and fireplace for safety. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That evening, just as the sun was setting, I noticed something strange. I had been chopping wood near the edge of the clearing when I saw a shape in the forest. At first, I thought it was a deer, but the shape was too upright, too still. I froze, trying to focus. It didn't move. My heart started racing. After a few minutes, it disappeared behind the trees. I told myself it was probably a person, maybe another hiker or someone who lived nearby. But the area was remote. There were no other cabins for miles. The thought made my stomach turn. I tried to ignore it and went back to the cabin. I locked all the doors and windows again, even though I had done it multiple times before. I stayed by the fire for hours, checking the perimeter through the windows, making sure no one was out there. I slept lightly that night, waking at every noise. Over the next few days, the feeling of being watched intensified. I found footprints near the edge of the clearing, large, heavy prints that weren't mine. They looked fresh. They weren't animal prints. My first thought was to leave, but the nearest town was a 2-hour drive away on the rough dirt road. And during this time, the weather began to change. Clouds gathered, and it started raining lightly. The dirt road would become nearly impossible to navigate if the rain continued. I felt trapped. I also noticed that some of my supplies were slightly out of place. A can of food that had been stacked neatly was now lying on its side. A small pile of firewood I had stacked was scattered. I knew I hadn't done it, and the wind couldn't have moved things inside the cabin. Fear started to creep in. I stayed inside as much as possible, keeping the fire going, checking every corner. Every sound outside made me jump. The isolation, the forest, the unknown. It all pressed on me like a physical weight. On the third night, the rain came down hard. The wind howled, and the trees bent under the force of the storm. I sat in the corner of the living room, blanket wrapped around me, listening to the noise. That night, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. They stopped at the door and the windows, as if someone was examining them. I held my breath, trying to stay calm. I remembered the hatchet I had in the kitchen and kept it near me. The sound eventually faded, but sleep was impossible. The next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the forest wet and heavy. I went outside cautiously, examining the area. There were fresh footprints around the cabin, some leading into the forest and some circling back. I realized someone had been outside during the storm. My hands shook as I examined them. They were human prints, big and heavy, possibly from a man. Fear set in fully now. This wasn't just an imagined presence. Someone had been watching me, following me, and maybe even staying close. I spent that day packing and preparing to leave. I needed to get back to civilization. I carefully gathered my things, trying to make as little noise as possible. I checked the car and it was fine. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Deep tire marks in the mud near the edge of the clearing, leading from the main dirt road and stopping a few dozen meters from the cabin. Someone had driven very close, maybe waiting, maybe watching. I stayed hidden, my heart hammering, and decided I couldn't leave during daylight. I needed a plan to get out safely. I waited until dusk. The forest was dim, shadows long and heavy. I started the car quietly, trying not to make any noise. I backed out slowly, watching the forest edges for movement. Nothing. The dirt road was muddy and slick from the rain, but I drove carefully, keeping an eye on the forest behind me. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. After about 20 minutes of driving, I saw lights in the distance. A small town appeared, and I felt a wave of relief I can't put into words. I didn't even slow down until I reached the first gas station. I parked, left the engine running, and sat for a few minutes just trying to calm down. I called the police, explained the situation, and gave them the cabin's location. They told me someone would check it, but by the time I drove back with authorities the next day, the cabin was empty. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing was stolen. But the prints, the tire marks, and the disturbed supplies were all there. Whoever it was had left, but the knowledge that someone had been that close to me, watching, was terrifying. I spent the night at a friend's house in town, unable to sleep. I kept imagining the cabin, the forest, and the person who had been there. But I also knew I was safe now. I had left the isolation behind, and while the memory would stay with me, I had survived. The experience taught me a hard lesson about solitude in the wild. It wasn't fear of the wilderness itself. It was fear of other people. Unknown, unpredictable, and very real. Weeks later, I went back, but this time with company and proper preparation. I didn't stay in the cabin alone again. We checked the surroundings carefully, secured everything, and stayed alert. It wasn't fun or relaxing like I had imagined, but we were safe. That was what mattered. I realized that nature was beautiful, but isolation in it could be dangerous in ways I hadn't considered. Being alone made me vulnerable, and that lesson stayed with me for the rest of my life. Now, every time I see a remote cabin online, I think twice. I still love the mountains, the forests, the quiet, but I also respect it. I understand that in the middle of nowhere, your safety can't be taken for granted. There are no stories or fairy tales in the forest, only reality, and sometimes reality is terrifying. Even though I survived, I learned to prepare better, to respect the wilderness, and to never underestimate the presence of other people, even in places where it seems there should be none. The cabin still exists, still stands in the forest, quiet and empty. I will never go back there alone. I had been planning this trip for months, thinking it would be a quiet, restorative escape from the constant noise of the city. The idea of spending a week alone in a small cabin deep in the forest had seemed perfect. I had grown tired of crowded hiking trails, people constantly chattering around me, and the way the world felt like it was always moving too fast. I wanted silence, stillness, and maybe some sense of control over my own time. I found the cabin online. a small listing tucked in a remote corner of the mountains, reachable only by a rough gravel road and a footpath that stretched through the woods. The photos had shown a modest wooden structure with a stone chimney and a little porch where I imagined sitting in the mornings with a cup of coffee. It seemed safe enough, though part of me knew I was looking for a little danger too, just the kind that comes from being completely alone with nature. I drove most of the day to get there, the city fading behind me as the roads turned narrow and uneven. The trees grew denser and taller, their thick trunks stretching up like walls. Occasionally, a deer would dart across the road, a blur of brown, disappearing into the shadows. By the time I reached the gravel turnoff that led to the cabin, the sun was low, casting long, golden slashes of light through the forest. The path was narrow, overgrown, and at times I had to maneuver carefully to avoid low-hanging branches scratching the paint of my car. Eventually, I reached the clearing where the cabin sat, small and unassuming, but somehow heavier in the woods than the photos had suggested. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not just the absence of traffic or voices, but a weight to it, the kind that pressed in on you when the forest is thick and there is nothing else. No birds were calling. The wind was faint, just enough to make the trees shiver, and my own footsteps sounded loud and alien. I parked the car, unloaded my bags, and stepped onto the porch. The wood creaked under my weight. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of old wood and dust, and the windows were smudged with dirt. I set my things down, lit a fire in the stone fireplace, and felt a small surge of satisfaction as the flames began to crackle and the room warmed. The first night passed uneventfully, though I woke once to a scratching sound outside the window. I assumed it was a raccoon or some other animal. I pulled the blanket tighter and went back to sleep. The next morning, I explored the surrounding woods. The trail I followed was overgrown, twisted with roots, and damp from the previous night's rain. I noticed how easy it would be to get lost if I wandered too far, the trees forming near-identical shapes around me, the path disappearing and reappearing like a mirage. I stayed mostly close to the cabin, collecting firewood and water from a nearby stream I had spotted. The water was cold but clear, and I drank enough to feel satisfied and strong. By the second night, the sense of isolation was more pronounced. The air was heavier, the darkness thicker. I had a battery-powered lantern, but it barely illuminated the room beyond a small radius. Outside, the forest seemed alive in a way I couldn't name. Branches tapped against the roof, and occasionally a distant, low thud echoed through the trees, like something heavy moving on the forest floor. I told myself it was normal, part of being alone in the wilderness, but a tension had begun to settle into my chest. My imagination kept supplying explanations. A bear dragging a carcass, a large animal breaking branches, someone else walking through the forest. I had cell service, barely, just enough to check messages, but no one would be able to reach me immediately if something went wrong. I felt a growing responsibility to be careful, to think 2 steps ahead. The third day, while chopping more firewood, I noticed something strange. A thin trail of footprints, partly obscured by the wet soil, leading from the cabin toward the denser forest. They were large, human-sized. At first, I thought maybe I had imagined them, or that a neighbor had wandered too close, though I had seen no signs of other cabins nearby. I followed the prints a little, keeping a safe distance, but the trail led only a few hundred feet before disappearing into thick underbrush. My stomach tightened. I returned to the cabin and double-checked the doors and windows. Everything was locked, yet the prints suggested someone had been near the cabin very recently. I spent the evening trying to ignore it, keeping the fire lit longer than usual, staying alert, checking every corner of the small structure. Night brought worse anxiety. Every sound became exaggerated. The snapping of branches, the rustle of leaves, the soft thud of something moving. I kept imagining shadows moving just outside the window, crouched figures hidden behind the trees. I made sure my phone was charged. I gathered a small knife and a flashlight, and I tried to stay calm. Sleep was difficult. I woke repeatedly, every time convinced I had heard someone outside, but the forest remained empty, at least visibly. The fourth day was the turning point. I went to check the trail again, trying to rationalize the fear. I wanted proof that it was just an animal or maybe a hiker passing through. When I followed the trail, I found something that made my stomach churn. Small items left near the trees, a half-buried can, a bit of fabric, a small plastic container with nothing inside. Whoever had been here wasn't just wandering. They had been watching, leaving signs, testing boundaries. I hurried back to the cabin, feeling my heartbeat in my throat. I double-checked the locks again, nailed down the windows where I could, and even moved the furniture to create a barrier against the doors. That night, I stayed by the fireplace, knife in hand, trying to focus on the fire and the comfort of warmth. But every creak, every gust of wind, made me tense, waiting for the moment someone would appear. By the 5th day, my situation had become almost unbearable. I didn't dare go far from the cabin anymore. I rationed water and food carefully, keeping my movements minimal. I set up a system of noise traps, small items I could rig to fall if someone tried to enter. My mind cycled constantly between panic and attempts at rational thinking. I reviewed every horror story I had ever heard about cabins, forests, and people alone. The fear wasn't of ghosts, but of real, tangible danger. Someone with intent, someone hidden. Every shadow became potential, every distant sound a threat. The isolation had grown oppressive. Night after night, I waited, tense, listening. The noises continued, closer now, sometimes circling the cabin, sometimes fading into the trees. I refused to open the door. I refused to call out for help, fearing that drawing attention might provoke whoever or whatever was out there. My body grew stiff, my nerves raw. I began to feel the psychological toll. My sleep was fragmented, my meals tasteless, my thoughts consumed by contingency plans and escape routes. I marked the perimeter with sticks and stones, tried to observe from the windows, but the thick forest made it nearly impossible to see more than a few yards. Then, one morning, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Not footsteps this time, but the sound of my car being tampered with outside. Tires crunching, metal scraping. My stomach dropped. I stayed low, pressed to the floor, listening. Whoever had been around the cabin had now reached my vehicle. I had parked it strategically so it blocked the easiest exit, but I realized now that the car wasn't just a means of escape. It was also a potential trap if someone wanted to corner me. My mind raced. I had to leave, but every exit route was exposed. I had no choice. I decided to wait for nightfall, hoping darkness would give me some cover. The night arrived, black and absolute. I gathered my supplies, food, water, flashlight, knife, and waited until I was sure the movements outside had slowed. Then I moved carefully, avoiding any branches that could snap or leaves that could rustle. I headed toward a secondary trail I had seen on the first day, one less obvious, leading down a slope into a small valley. I moved slowly, deliberately, keeping low, making my steps soft. Every crack, every brush of leaves, made my heart hammer, but I forced myself to focus on the path ahead. Hours later, exhausted, covered in scratches and dirt, I emerged from the forest onto a logging road I hadn't noticed on the map. I could see faint lights in the distance. Cars, perhaps houses, and the sound of civilization felt almost unreal after days of silence. I ran toward it, adrenaline driving me, until I found a small gas station. I called the police, explained everything, and gave the location of the cabin. Officers arrived the next day and investigated. They found footprints, discarded items, and signs that someone had been watching me, preparing to approach more directly. But the intruder had vanished before they could be caught. The aftermath was surreal. I stayed in a nearby town for a few days, sleeping in a real bed with locks and walls that actually felt secure. The cabin was abandoned after that, and the rental service removed it from the listings. I never returned to that part of the forest. I realized that the fear I had experienced wasn't from imagination. It was from real, tangible human intent. The thought that someone could be lurking, watching, planning without my knowledge had been more terrifying than anything else. Looking back, the experience changed the way I viewed isolation. I had sought solitude and found something far more intense, something primal in the awareness of vulnerability. The forest, the silence, the shadows, They were all beautiful in daylight, but they became dangerous when coupled with human malice. I learned that preparedness, awareness, and respect for the unknown in the real world are not just habits. They are survival skills. Months later, I returned to hiking and cabins, but differently. I never went alone again. I always kept multiple means of communication, checked every route, and observed the forest with cautious eyes. I also realized that while nature can be indifferent, it is human beings who are unpredictable, capable of cruelty and stealth in ways that silence, darkness, and isolation can magnify. That cabin, deep in the forest, had been a test I hadn't wanted, but it left me stronger, more alert, and more aware of the fine line between solitude and danger. I had been planning this trip for months, trying to escape the city and the constant noise of people, cars, and machines. The cabin was tucked deep in the mountains, far from roads and cell service. I had found it online, a small, rustic wooden structure, surrounded by thick forest, a stream running nearby. It was the kind of place that looked peaceful in pictures, but I soon realized that peace could have a sharp edge to it. The drive to the cabin was long, winding along narrow mountain roads, the trees growing so close that their branches scratched the sides of my car. I passed a few old wooden signs warning about steep cliffs and falling rocks. There were no other cars, no houses, nothing except trees and rocks. When I finally reached the dirt path leading to the cabin, I had to leave my car behind because the road was too rough. I unpacked my things and started walking. The sun was already low, painting the sky in orange and pink. Shadows were long and strange, and I felt a thrill mixed with a small, nervous chill. The cabin itself was smaller than I had imagined, maybe 3 rooms in total. A main living area, a tiny kitchen, and a single bedroom. It smelled faintly of damp wood and old smoke. The windows were dusty, and the lock on the door was old but sturdy. I dropped my backpack inside and walked around the cabin, checking the small porch, the fire pit outside, and the stream. The water was clear and cold, running over rocks and fallen branches. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and unease. This was exactly what I had wanted. Isolation, quiet, time alone. The first night passed quietly. I slept poorly, mostly because I was not used to the complete silence. In the city, there was always a hum, a distant car, a siren, people talking. Here there was nothing. I woke up several times, convinced I heard the wind move through the trees in a way that sounded like footsteps. Each time, I would sit up in bed, staring into the dark room, waiting. But it was always just the wind, the creaking of the cabin, maybe a branch falling outside. The second day, I decided to explore the area. I hiked up a narrow trail that led to a ridge overlooking a valley. The view was breathtaking. Trees stretched in every direction. Mountains rose in layers, and far below, the stream I had seen near the cabin sparkled in the sunlight. I felt free, like the weight of my city life had lifted off my shoulders. But when I started heading back, I realized how easily someone could get lost here. There were no markers, just trees and rocks and the faint trail I had walked on. I kept track of the stream, thinking it would lead me back, and eventually, I found the cabin again. That night, something strange happened. I had been reading on the porch, listening to the water when I thought I heard a sound behind me. A faint crunch of leaves, like someone was walking. I froze. My mind immediately tried to rationalize it. Maybe an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the crunching didn't stop. It moved closer. I turned quickly, but I saw nothing. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it around. The beam fell on trees and rocks, but nothing moved. Then I heard it again, closer now, heavier, like the sound of boots on gravel. My heart raced. I went inside, locked the door, and checked every window. Nothing. I sat in the dark, listening, my flashlight in hand. The sound eventually stopped. I told myself it was an animal, my imagination, anything but what I feared. But sleep was impossible after that. The next morning, I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin. I walked around slowly, inspecting the trees and the ground for tracks. I found nothing human, Nothing that suggested anyone else had been there recently. Just animal tracks, mostly small, and the marks of the stream's rocks. Relief mixed with nervous energy. I was alone, truly alone. Yet the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. By the third night, I was more alert. I had stacked firewood near the door, placed rocks around the cabin in case I had to make noise, and kept a heavy stick nearby. I tried to sleep, but every sound made me tense. Branches breaking, leaves rustling, the stream gurgling. Around midnight, I woke up again. This time, I heard a slow knock on the cabin door. 3 knocks, deliberate, spaced out. My heart froze. I was sure I had locked the door. I held my breath, trying to listen. Nothing moved outside after that. I stayed awake the rest of the night, flashlight ready, eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. The next morning, I searched outside. There were footprints in the dirt near the porch, wet, heavy, human-sized. I had been careful to only walk on the rocks and leave no marks. Yet here were prints, clearly not mine. Panic hit me like a wave. Whoever it was had been here while I was inside. I checked the locks, the windows, even the chimney. Everything was intact. There was no way they could have entered without breaking something. And yet, the prints told me someone had been close, watching. I decided to leave, but when I tried to pack my things, I realized my car had a flat tire. I hadn't noticed it when I arrived. My supplies were heavy, and the road was rough. I had no cell signal. I tried to remain calm. I could fix the tire, I thought, but the thought of someone nearby made my hands shake as I worked. I patched the tire temporarily with what I had, enough to get the car moving slowly, but the fear stayed with me. As I was leaving, I noticed movement at the edge of the trees. A figure far away, standing completely still. I couldn't see clearly, but I saw the shape of a person. My heart raced. I got into the car, locked the doors, and started driving slowly down the dirt path, keeping my eyes on the edge of the forest. The figure didn't move. I drove faster, the narrow path rattling the car, the branches scratching the sides. When I finally reached a wider road, I pulled over to catch my breath. The figure was gone. I called the police immediately. They said I had been in a remote area with no cell coverage, but they took my description and said they would investigate. A few days later, the police called. They had found a man living in an abandoned cabin not far from where I had stayed. He had been watching people come and go, hiding during the day, following them at night. They said he had a history of violence, but fortunately, he had fled the area before I returned to the cabin. The cabin was safe again, but I never went back. I realized later that the forest, the mountains, and the isolation were not just peaceful, they could be dangerous. I learned to respect that. I learned that even when you are alone, you are never truly alone, and the quiet can hide a lot of danger. That trip stayed with me, not because of the beauty of the mountains or the stream, but because I understood how quickly a place that feels safe can turn into a trap. And I was lucky to leave with nothing worse than fear and a story to tell. It started with a long drive. I had rented a small, isolated cabin deep in the woods, a place I thought would be perfect to get away from everything. My work had been suffocating, and I needed silence, solitude, and a break from the constant noise of life in the city. The directions had been simple enough at first, a GPS route that cut through a few small towns, then winding dirt roads that narrowed and eventually turned into barely noticeable tracks disappearing into dense forest. By the time I parked my car near the cabin, the sun was already low, slipping behind the thick canopy of pines and maples. The cabin itself was small, made of dark, weathered wood, with a single stone chimney that hinted at a fireplace inside. There were no lights, no nearby houses, and the only sound was the wind through the trees and the occasional creak of branches brushing against each other. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange mixture of relief and unease. The quiet was comforting, but there was something about the remoteness that made me suddenly aware of how alone I was. I carried my bags inside and set them on the floor, scanning the cabin. It was simple but functional. There was a small kitchen, a table, a couch that looked a little worn, and the fireplace, which had been swept clean of ashes. The bedroom was tiny, with a single bed and a window that looked out over the forest. I unpacked slowly, taking my time, making sure everything was in order. Part of me wanted to settle in for a relaxing night, but another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though logically, I knew I wasn't. The first night passed quietly. I lit a fire in the fireplace and sat on the couch, reading a book until the flames died down. The wind outside picked up at some point, rattling the windows and whistling through the gaps in the wood, but I was exhausted and eventually fell asleep. The second day, I decided to explore the area. There was a small creek a few hundred meters from the cabin, and the forest seemed dense but navigable. I took my backpack, filled with water, some snacks, a flashlight, and a pocket knife, just in case. The walk was calming at first. Birds called from the trees, leaves rustled under my boots, and sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating patches of gold on the ground. But as I walked deeper, the forest grew darker, the trees closer together, and the underbrush thicker. I noticed a set of footprints in the mud near the creek. They were fresh, large, and oddly spaced. I froze for a moment, trying to convince myself it was just a deer or some other animal. But the shape of the footprints didn't match anything I could think of. Too large for a dog, too narrow for a bear, with a deep tread pattern that suggested a heavy boot. I turned back toward the cabin, feeling a knot of unease in my stomach. By the third night, the feeling of being watched had grown stronger. I tried to ignore it at first, convincing myself that the isolation was messing with my mind. But when I went to the kitchen to get water, I noticed something strange. The back door, which I had locked before going to bed, was slightly ajar. My heart jumped. I had been careful, I always double-checked the locks. My mind raced through possibilities, none of them comforting. A simple explanation would have been a draft, but the door had been solid, heavy, and I would have noticed if the wind had moved it. I spent the rest of that night on edge. I kept a heavy flashlight by the bed, and the pocket knife felt reassuring in my hand. I didn't sleep well, the wind outside now sounding like footsteps circling the cabin. Every snap of a branch, every rustle in the leaves made me flinch. I tried to tell myself that the forest was alive, that animals were moving around, but the feeling wouldn't go away. The next morning, I decided to stay inside, barricading the door with a chair and checking the windows. I spent hours scanning the perimeter through the glass, seeing nothing but the swaying trees and patches of sunlight. Still, I found it impossible to relax. My nerves were frayed, and every sound made me jump. Around midday, I noticed something else. Footprints, heavy boot prints, partially obscured by the mud, leading from the edge of the woods toward the cabin. My stomach dropped. Someone had been walking around my cabin while I was inside. The logical part of my mind tried to calm me, thinking maybe a hiker had passed by, but the placement of the prints made it clear they had come very close to the door, close enough that if the intruder had wanted, they could have entered without me noticing. I realized then that the cabin wasn't just remote, it was vulnerable. There was no cell service, no neighbors within miles, and no one to hear me if something happened. Panic started to rise, sharp and insistent. I knew I had to act, but what could I do? Running into the forest would be dangerous, and staying inside meant waiting for whoever was out there to make their move. I spent the afternoon fortifying the cabin. I moved heavy furniture in front of the doors and windows, checked every lock, and kept my knife and flashlight within reach. I found a heavy cast iron skillet in the kitchen and kept it by the bed. Every noise outside made my heart pound. At one point, I thought I saw movement through the window, a shadow that disappeared as soon as I blinked. That night was worse than the previous ones. The wind had died down, but the forest seemed louder. I could hear twigs snapping, leaves crunching, and an occasional low thud, as if someone heavy was walking just beyond the edge of the trees. I stayed awake, sitting on the bed, knife in hand, waiting. Hours passed, each one slower than the last, until I realized dawn was approaching. The first light of morning made the shadows retreat, and with it, some of the terror that had gripped me. When I finally got the courage to step outside, I saw something that froze me in place. Around the cabin, in the mud and dirt, were dozens of footprints, heavy boots, some overlapping, some leading in and out from the tree line. Someone had circled the cabin, pacing, watching, waiting, and in the dirt near the back door, there was a deep indentation, as if someone had tried to force the door open. My hands shook as I considered my options. Staying would be unsafe, but leaving on foot could be worse if the intruder was still nearby. I decided to go to the car, which I had parked a short distance away. Moving slowly, cautiously, I kept my eyes on the trees, flashlight off, listening for any sound. Halfway there, I stepped on a branch that snapped loudly under my foot. I froze, heart racing, scanning the forest, but no movement came. I ran the last few meters to the car, fumbling with the keys. Once inside, I locked the doors and started the engine. My hands were slick with sweat, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see a figure emerge from the trees. The drive back down the winding dirt roads was tense. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves made me flinch. I didn't stop until I reached a small town, where I pulled into a gas station and finally let myself breathe. I reported what had happened to the local authorities. They listened, took notes, and promised to patrol the area, though they made it clear that in such remote regions, incidents like this were difficult to prevent. They told me there had been other reports of trespassers, sometimes armed, sometimes just trespassing for reasons that never became clear. A few days later, I returned to the cabin with a friend who had experience with security and wilderness safety. We installed stronger locks, motion sensor lights, and even a small camera system to monitor the perimeter. It wasn't perfect, but it gave me a sense of control. I spent the next few weeks checking the footage, seeing strange shadows moving at odd hours, leaves brushing against the sensors, and sometimes the faint outline of a figure in the distance, but never close enough to catch clearly. The experience changed me. I realized how vulnerable I had been, how easily someone could have taken advantage of isolation. I learned to respect the quiet of the forest and the solitude of remote spaces, understanding that danger often comes not from the supernatural, but from people and circumstances beyond your control. Months later, I returned to the cabin again, this time prepared. I carried more supplies, kept a phone with signal boosters, and never stayed alone for more than a few hours. The forest was beautiful, serene even, but I never forgot the fear I felt during those first nights, the awareness that someone had been close enough to touch the walls I thought protected me. Eventually, I felt safe enough to stay overnight again. I lit the fireplace, unpacked my bags, and settled in. The wind blew gently through the trees, and the shadows of the forest no longer seemed menacing. I had learned to trust my instincts, prepare for the unexpected, and respect the isolation without letting it control me. The cabin remained a place of escape, but I never again underestimated the quiet, the shadows, or the weight of being completely alone. I had been planning the trip for months. I wanted to get away from the city, from the noise and the constant movement, from the lights and the endless hum of people. I needed a place where I could be completely alone, somewhere I could disappear for a while and not feel like the walls of my apartment were closing in. I found it online, a small, isolated cabin deep in the forest, a few miles from the nearest town. The pictures made it look perfect. Weathered wood, a stone chimney, a small porch overlooking a lake that glittered under the afternoon sun. The owner assured me it was completely private, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that was usually empty. That was exactly what I wanted. I arrived late in the afternoon. The dirt road leading to the cabin twisted through thick trees, the branches pressing close on either side, and by the time I parked, the sun was already low in the sky. The forest was quiet in a way I wasn't used to. No birds calling, no distant cars, just a kind of heavy silence that seemed to press against the car windows. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures. Its wood had darkened with age, and a thin wisp of smoke curled from the chimney. I carried my bag inside, setting it down on the worn wooden floor, and took a slow walk around the porch. Everything was exactly as it should be, and yet something about the way the forest pressed in around the clearing made my skin crawl. The interior was small but comfortable. A single room combined the kitchen, living area, and sleeping space. The furniture was old but solid. There was a wood stove in the corner, stacks of firewood neatly piled next to it. I unpacked my things, unpacked my supplies for cooking, and settled in. The first night was uneventful, except for the sound of the wind rattling the windows. I lit the stove and sat on the couch with a book, feeling the warmth spread through the room. Outside, the forest was black and still, the lake nothing but a shadow beyond the trees. That first night, I slept lightly. I woke several times, convinced I had heard footsteps outside the cabin. Each time I turned on a light and checked the perimeter, but there was nothing. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, branches scraping against the cabin, the creaks of an old building settling into the cold. By morning, the unease hadn't gone, but I pushed it aside. I reminded myself why I had come. To be alone, to get away from people, to feel quiet. The next day, I decided to explore the area. I walked down to the lake. The water was calm, glassy, reflecting the forest like a dark mirror. The forest around me seemed denser than it looked from the cabin. Every step on the leaf-strewn ground felt loud, echoing in the silence. I noticed that the dirt road I had driven in on was almost invisible from the lake, swallowed by undergrowth and shadows. The isolation felt heavier here, more real. That night, I had trouble sleeping again. I could hear the occasional snap of twigs outside, the sound coming closer than it should. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the window, trying to convince myself it was animals. Deer, raccoons, maybe a fox. But the sounds were different. They weren't moving the way animals moved. They seemed deliberate, slow, careful, almost like someone was walking around the cabin, making sure I noticed. The next day, I checked the cabin thoroughly. Doors locked, windows secured. I even walked around the perimeter, shining a flashlight into the trees, trying to spot anything unusual. There was nothing. No footprints, no signs anyone had been there. Nothing to explain the feeling that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was paranoia, the kind that comes from being isolated, from spending too many hours in the dark with only the wind and my own thoughts. But then I found it. It was subtle at first. A small scratch on the wooden railing of the porch, one I hadn't noticed before. Not deep, barely noticeable, but enough to make my stomach tighten. I checked the rest of the porch, the windowsills, the log steps down to the ground. Small scratches, tiny indentations in the soil near the cabin, where there hadn't been any before. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the previous tenant had left it. Maybe it was animals, though nothing I knew could leave scratches like that. That night, the sounds outside returned, louder, more confident. The wind wasn't the only thing rustling in the trees. I could hear footsteps circling the cabin, slow, deliberate, pausing at times, as if whoever or whatever was out there was listening as much as I was. I stayed inside, locked the doors, drew the curtains. I didn't sleep at all. The night stretched endlessly. The next morning, I noticed something else. A footprint in the mud near the back of the cabin. It was fresh, human, and much larger than mine. I didn't recognize the shoe pattern, didn't recognize the shape. My heart pounded. I double-checked the locks, searched the windows. Nothing. Whoever had left it was gone. But the thought of them having been here while I slept terrified me. I realized I couldn't stay in the cabin without knowing who or what was out there. I debated leaving immediately, but the road was long and winding, and I wasn't sure what time it would take to get back to civilization safely. I needed a plan. I gathered supplies, filled a backpack with food, water, a flashlight, and my phone. I made sure the car was fueled. Then I spent the day reinforcing the cabin as best I could. I wedged furniture against the doors, stacked extra firewood around the windows, anything to make it harder for someone to get in. Night fell again, and the footsteps started once more. This time, they didn't just circle the cabin. They moved to the far side, then the near side, pausing at the windows. I could hear something brushing against the walls, tiny knocks, the faint sound of metal scraping against wood. Fear clawed at me in a way I hadn't expected. I stayed completely still, listening, knowing that one wrong move could give away my position. Hours passed. The noise never left. Eventually, exhaustion won. I forced myself to sleep in shifts, every 20 minutes checking the windows, holding the flashlight in one hand and a hatchet in the other. Morning came, gray and cold. I saw no one. The footprints outside were gone. Nothing had been taken, no signs of forced entry. I packed the car as quickly as possible, triple-checked everything, and started down the dirt road. Every few hundred meters, I stopped, scanning the trees, expecting to see someone following me, watching. But there was nothing. The forest was empty, silent. The relief I felt was almost paralyzing. I didn't speak to anyone on the drive back. I didn't call for help because I wasn't sure what I would say. Whoever had been there had left no direct threat, but the message was clear. I wasn't alone, not truly, and the forest was theirs as much as it was mine. I reached the nearest town just as the sun rose fully, its light spilling over the streets and buildings, the hum of people and cars washing over me like a wave. I stayed there overnight in a cheap motel, the door locked, the lights on. Sleep was difficult, but the fear of the forest outside had loosened its grip. In the days that followed, I researched the area. The cabin had been rented occasionally, but there were reports of people noticing signs of trespassers, strange footprints, things moved or broken without explanation. Local authorities suggested it might be hunters, local residents checking abandoned cabins, people familiar with the woods who could move silently. It made sense. Not comforting, but plausible. Eventually, I returned home. I didn't go back to the cabin. I sold the car I had used to get there, deleted the rental listing from my saved files, and avoided thinking about the forest for weeks. But the experience stayed with me. The quiet, the stillness, the feeling that someone was always just outside the window watching, it never left entirely. I realized that even in the middle of nowhere, in a place that seemed completely isolated, there are always other people. Sometimes they're harmless, sometimes not. And sometimes they make themselves known without ever revealing themselves fully. I still think about the cabin sometimes, especially when I hear a strange noise outside at night, the wind rattling the windows. I remember the way the forest pressed in, the heavy silence that made every sound feel deliberate, the way the small scratches on the porch made my stomach twist. I remember the footprint in the mud, the one that wasn't mine, and the slow, careful steps circling the cabin while I couldn't sleep. I learned a lot from that trip, about fear, about isolation, about how even the quietest, most peaceful places can hide someone else's presence. I learned to respect it, to be cautious, to prepare, and to never underestimate how alone you really are, even when the forest makes you think you are the only living thing in the world. Eventually, I moved on, but I carry the memory with me. I carry the image of the cabin, the lake, the forest, and the footsteps outside my window, and I carry the understanding that safety is never guaranteed, even in places that feel perfectly still. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The city had been suffocating me, and I needed to get away, somewhere isolated, where no one could reach me and I could breathe without the constant noise of traffic, people, and deadlines. I rented a small cabin far in the mountains, the kind of place that showed up on websites with glowing photos and exaggerated descriptions. Secluded, peaceful, surrounded by wilderness, perfect for unwinding. The reviews were mostly positive, though a few mentioned that cell service was spotty and that the nearest town was more than an hour away. I didn't care. In fact, I liked the idea of being completely cut off. The drive was long, winding through roads that narrowed and dipped dangerously along cliffs and dense forests. I had a map, but I mostly relied on my GPS, which occasionally lost signal, giving me that small flutter of unease that comes from realizing you're not entirely in control. By the time I reached the small dirt track that led to the cabin, the sun was low, painting everything in shades of orange and red. The forest felt heavy, almost oppressive, but I told myself it was just the beauty of nature. The cabin appeared at the end of the path, tucked against a slope and partially hidden by pine trees. It was smaller than I expected, but solid, with a wooden porch and a stone chimney. Smoke wasn't rising from it yet. I was the first guest of the season. I parked, unloaded my things, and stepped onto the porch. The air was crisp, cold in the shadows, and smelled faintly of pine and damp earth. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cabin was rustic but functional. A small living area with a wood-burning stove, a kitchen corner, a table, and a single bedroom with a bed. It smelled faintly of old wood and dust, but it was clean. I set my bag down and immediately started a fire in the stove. The warm glow and the sound of crackling would instantly easing the tension I had carried in from the drive. Night came quickly. I had dinner, simple canned beans and bread, and sat by the fire, reading a book. Outside, the forest seemed alive in a way I hadn't realized during the day. Every sound was sharper. The rustling of leaves, the snap of twigs, the occasional distant cry of an animal. I reminded myself that it was normal. There were deer, maybe wolves, raccoons, and other wildlife. Still, every noise seemed amplified by the darkness. By 11, I decided to go to bed. The cabin was silent except for the fire and the occasional groan of the wooden frame settling in the cold night. I slept fitfully, waking a few times to the sounds outside. At one point, I could have sworn someone was moving near the edge of the trees, but it was probably a deer, or so I told myself. The next morning, I woke early. The sun barely touched the peaks, and mist lingered between the trees. I dressed in layers, had coffee, and decided to explore the area around the cabin. There was a small trail that led into the woods, probably used by hunters or hikers. I followed it, careful to leave markers for my way back. The forest was beautiful in the morning light, but there was something that made me feel watched. I couldn't see anyone, but the feeling didn't go away. I shook it off, blaming exhaustion and being alone. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin. The sun was still high, but the shadows of the trees stretched long. I noticed something strange. The firewood I had stacked neatly was disturbed. Some pieces were moved, but there were no footprints in the dirt around the cabin. At least none that I could see clearly. My stomach tightened. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog. Still, the careful stacking of the wood made me doubt that. I spent the next hour reinforcing the cabin a little. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. I kept my phone close, though service was patchy. Night fell again, and the forest became a shadowed maze. I ate quickly, built another fire, and tried to read, but my mind wandered. Every sound outside seemed deliberate, heavy with intent. Around midnight, I heard it, slow, careful footsteps crunching on the path leading to the cabin. I froze. My heart slammed against my chest. I was certain now that it wasn't an animal. The steps stopped at the edge of the porch. Whoever it was stood just beyond the tree line, silent now, but waiting. I debated what to do. The first instinct was to call the police, but my phone had no signal. I considered running to my car, but that would put me in the open. I grabbed a heavy cast iron pan from the kitchen, holding it like a weapon, and crept quietly to the window to get a better look. There was a figure, tall, wearing dark clothing that blended with the shadows. They weren't moving, just standing there, looking toward the cabin. My blood ran cold. I realized that whoever this was, they had probably been watching me for hours. Maybe since the night before, maybe longer. I stayed silent, breathing slowly, and waited. The figure moved slightly, shifting from one foot to the other. Then, unexpectedly, they turned and walked away, slowly disappearing into the trees. I waited another hour, listening, but no more footsteps came. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, sitting by the fire, pan in hand, eyes on every shadow outside the window. Morning brought a pale sun and a clearer head. I inspected the cabin again. Nothing else seemed disturbed. The trail back into the woods showed no clear tracks. Whoever it was had left without a trace. My first instinct was to leave immediately, but the road was still long, and I wanted to pack properly. I decided to stay vigilant and keep the fire going as a deterrent. The next day, I explored again, but only along well-marked areas, never straying far from sight of the cabin. I noticed broken branches and small clearings where someone could hide. The reality was sinking in. Someone had been near my cabin, close enough to watch me, and I had no idea why. It could have been a criminal, a stalker, a drifter. The idea of being alone in the woods suddenly felt dangerous. Over the next 2 days, I remained hyper-aware. I reinforced the doors with makeshift barricades, kept a knife and the pan within reach, and slept in shifts with one eye on the window. Every sound made me jump. Even birds seemed threatening. The isolation that had once felt peaceful now felt like a trap. I realized the photos of the cabin online didn't show the corners of the property, the areas where someone could approach unseen. On the third night, I heard the footsteps again. They were lighter this time, closer, circling the cabin. I stayed still, trying not to make a sound, listening. The figure paused by the edge of the porch, and I held my breath, ready to strike if needed. Then, unexpectedly, I remembered the car. It was still outside, full of gas. If I could wait for a distraction, I might be able to make it out. I lit the fire again, letting the smoke rise high. Maybe it would obscure the view from outside. Then I picked up my backpack and moved slowly to the door. Just as I opened it, I noticed the figure dart behind a tree, startled by the sudden movement. I didn't hesitate. I ran down the path, my bag bouncing against my back, heart hammering, and didn't stop until I reached the car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling. The figure appeared at the end of the trail again, watching. I started the car and floored it, the tires kicking up dirt as I sped down the narrow road. I didn't slow down, not even for curves. The figure stayed at the tree line until the car was far away, then disappeared. I drove for hours, finally stopping in the nearest town when the road widened and traffic returned. I called the police from a gas station, reporting the incident. They were skeptical at first, a lone witness, no evidence, but they took the report seriously enough to send officers to check the area. Weeks later, I learned that a transient had been living in abandoned structures near the cabin. He had a history of stalking properties and occasionally approaching isolated cabins, watching residents without ever directly confronting them. The authorities assured me that he was apprehended before he could attempt anything further. The experience left me shaken, but it also taught me something important. Isolation, while tempting, carries real risks. Nature is beautiful, but humans are unpredictable. I never returned to that cabin. Instead, I started taking shorter trips closer to towns, always leaving someone informed of my whereabouts. The fear I felt that night never fully went away, but it faded into a cautious respect for the wilderness, and for the fact that danger doesn't always announce itself. Even now, I sometimes think about that dark forest, the quiet footsteps at the edge of the trees, and the way it felt to know someone had been so close, watching, invisible but real. I'm grateful I left when I did, and I'm grateful that, despite the fear, I kept my wits about me. That clarity saved me. I had been planning this trip for months, telling myself I needed the silence, the escape from the endless hum of the city, the emails, the phone calls, the constant motion that never seemed to stop. I packed my car the night before with all the essentials I thought I'd need. Enough food for a week, a small first aid kit, batteries, a flashlight, warm clothes, my camera, a couple of books, and a heavy-duty sleeping bag. I had driven this route before, through winding roads lined with thick forests, the kind of trees that seemed to stretch into the sky endlessly, their branches interlocking to form a natural tunnel that swallowed the sun during the day. My destination was a small cabin I had found listed online, off-grid, with no electricity and no running water. It was exactly what I thought I wanted. Isolation, quiet, a chance to hear my own thoughts without interruption. The drive itself was uneventful, though as I went deeper into the forest, the air felt heavier, more enclosed. The road narrowed, the pavement giving way to dirt and gravel, and I had to slow down to avoid hitting stones or branches. Occasionally, I would see the tracks of animals. Deer, raccoons, maybe a bear, crisscrossing the road. The sun was beginning to drop behind the trees when I finally saw it. The cabin. It looked smaller than I imagined, constructed of old, weathered logs that had darkened with age. The windows were dusty, and the small porch sagged in one corner, but it had a rugged charm that made me feel like I had found a secret place meant for me alone. I parked and unloaded my car, carrying everything inside carefully. The cabin smelled of damp wood and old earth, the kind of smell that clings to the skin if you stay in it too long. I set my supplies on the counter and took a deep breath, feeling the quiet settle over me like a heavy blanket. The wind rustled the trees outside, but inside, it was still, almost unnaturally still. I lit the small wood stove in the corner and fed it a few pieces of kindling I had brought. The fire caught quickly, and I felt a warmth spreading through my chest that had nothing to do with the actual heat. I unpacked my sleeping bag and laid it across the single bed in the corner, arranging my things neatly around me, almost ritualistically. That night I slept lightly. The sounds of the forest surrounded me. The distant call of an owl, the rustle of leaves, maybe a fox moving in the underbrush, but I told myself they were normal, expected. It wasn't until the second night that I first heard the steps outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, branches scraping against the cabin, but the sound was too deliberate, too steady, too heavy. I froze in bed, straining to listen. The steps circled the cabin, slow and careful, as though someone was testing me, seeing if I was awake. I considered lighting the fire and going outside to confront whoever or whatever it was, but the rational part of me whispered that it could be an animal, a bear maybe, or a deer stepping on dry leaves. Still, the pattern was wrong. Bears didn't walk with such precision, such intention. I stayed awake the rest of that night, flashlight in hand, listening. The steps returned intermittently, always starting and stopping, always circling the cabin. By morning, I was exhausted, eyes burning, but I convinced myself that it had been my imagination, that isolation was playing tricks on my mind. I forced a smile as I ate a quick breakfast of canned beans heated over the stove. I told myself that staying rational was the only way to survive in this kind of place. The following days were tense but uneventful. I collected firewood, explored a small trail behind the cabin, and took photographs of the forest, capturing the way the sunlight fell through the trees in dappled patterns on the ground. But every night, the footsteps returned. Always outside, always deliberate. I began to notice small signs too. A branch snapped just beyond the window, footprints in the soft earth near the porch, though I could never make out what had made them. Once, I saw a shadow moving across the tree-line, too fast for a deer, too controlled for a fox. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, that the isolation was affecting my mind, but my gut refused to let me. One night, I made the mistake of looking out the window for too long. The moon was bright, full and cold, and the shadows of the trees stretched like black fingers across the forest floor. I saw a figure standing just beyond the edge of the clearing, obscured partly by trees but unmistakably human. It was still watching, its head tilting slightly, as though studying me. My heart jumped into my throat, and I stumbled back from the window. The figure didn't move for a long while, then slowly turned and disappeared into the trees. I couldn't breathe properly for several minutes, my body trembling in ways I had no control over. That night, I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I packed my backpack with essentials, telling myself I would leave, that I couldn't risk staying another night. But when I stepped outside, I realized the seriousness of my isolation. The small road I had driven in on was now partly obscured by fallen branches and thick underbrush, as if nature itself were pushing me back. My car was just barely visible, half hidden by the dense growth. The realization hit me hard. If someone wanted to, they could easily block me in and I would be trapped. The footprints from the previous nights were still visible, fresh in the damp soil, leading in a wide circle around the cabin. I started to understand that this was no random intruder. Whoever had been outside knew the area, knew the cabin, and was observing me carefully. I spent the day fortifying the cabin as best as I could. I moved furniture to block the door, sharpened a kitchen knife, and collected extra firewood so that I wouldn't have to leave the cabin after dark. I kept the stove burning even in the heat of the day, partly for warmth, partly because fire felt protective, and partly to have light that might reveal anything approaching in the shadows. My food and water were limited, but I knew I had enough to survive a few more days if needed. The tension made my hands shake, my muscles ache, but I couldn't allow myself to panic. I kept thinking that if I stayed calm, if I stayed rational, I might make it through. Night fell like a stone. The footsteps began again almost immediately after sunset, moving in slow, measured circles around the cabin. I held the knife tightly, crouched near a window, watching. Hours passed with only the sounds of the forest, until the steps stopped abruptly. I froze, straining my ears. Then came the sound of scraping, faint at first, like someone dragging something across the ground. My stomach dropped. I realized with horror that it was coming from the direction of the car. My first instinct was to run, but I knew it would be suicide to leave the cabin in the dark. Whoever it was could see me, could grab me before I even reached the clearing. I decided to wait, counting the minutes as if each one could be my last. The scraping stopped. Then a low, steady rustle moved closer to the cabin itself, circling it like a predator. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. The person or people outside were testing me, seeing if I would leave, seeing how I would react. My thoughts became a cyclone of fear and planning. I considered climbing out the back window, making a run for the forest and trying to reach the main road, but the terrain was steep, full of fallen logs and hidden ravines. I realized that staying put and fortifying the cabin was my only chance. Hours passed. The footsteps, the scraping, the rustling, they never stopped. I stayed awake, alert, and waiting. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and I dozed in brief, restless spurts, waking at every creak and rustle. At some point, just before dawn, the sounds stopped completely. I didn't dare look outside. I didn't move for a long while, lying on the floor, listening. Then, finally, light began to creep through the windows. I waited until full daylight before venturing outside, the knife still in my hand. What I saw made my stomach turn. Around the perimeter of the cabin, the ground was trampled, branches were broken, and footprints led all the way around. Near the car, I saw that someone had tried to move it, scratching the paint with rocks, leaving deep gouges. There was a small pile of dirt near the tires, as though someone had tried to bury the car partially or hide it. But there was no one in sight, and the forest was quiet again, eerily quiet. I knew then that I couldn't stay. I packed quickly, loading only essentials into my backpack. I left everything else behind, including food, books, and my sleeping bag. The path to the main road was partially obscured, but I forced myself to stay calm, carefully navigating fallen branches and hidden holes. Every rustle in the trees made me freeze. Every shadow made my heart race, but I kept moving, slow and deliberate. Eventually, I reached the dirt road, which had widened enough to allow a car to pass. I ran the remaining distance to the road, my body trembling with fatigue and fear. After what felt like hours, I finally reached a highway. I waved down a passing car, and the driver stopped, giving me a ride to the nearest town. I called the authorities, reporting the situation, the footprints, the damaged car, everything. They took my statement seriously, though they told me it would be difficult to investigate such a remote area. I didn't care. I was safe, and that was all that mattered. It took weeks for the adrenaline to fully wear off, and months before I could stop replaying the nights in the cabin over and over in my mind. But I recovered. I moved to a different part of the country, changed my routines, and avoided isolated areas for a long time. And though I never found out who had been outside that cabin, I learned something important. Fear is not always about what you see. Sometimes it is about what you feel, and survival depends not on courage alone, but on awareness, patience, and the careful calculation of every action. I never returned to that forest, never went back to the cabin, but the memory of it stayed with me. Even now, years later, I can remember the silence, the shadows, the cold weight of the night pressing against the walls, and the terrible realization that I was being watched by someone who knew me better than I knew myself in that moment. And I am grateful that I made it out alive, clear-headed and unharmed, because that night could have ended very differently. I had been planning this cabin trip for months. It was supposed to be a quiet, solitary escape into the woods, a place where I could be completely alone and away from the noise of the city. The cabin was tucked deep into the forest, miles from the nearest road. From what I had read online, it was a simple, rustic structure, nothing fancy, Just a wooden cabin with a small porch, a fireplace, a couple of bedrooms, and a kitchen. The owners had mentioned that the water supply was from a well, and the electricity was limited, mostly solar-powered lights and a generator that could be used sparingly. That sounded perfect. I wanted to be disconnected. I wanted to experience real solitude. The drive up to the cabin was long, winding through narrow forest roads lined with thick pines and oaks. The air was crisp, and the smell of wet soil and decaying leaves filled the car. I remember how the road became less maintained the further I went, turning into gravel and then dirt tracks. There were moments when the forest seemed so dense that sunlight barely broke through, and the shadows of the trees stretched across the road in strange patterns. At one point, I had to slow down because a fallen branch blocked half of the path. I pushed it aside and continued, thinking little of it. When I finally reached the clearing where the cabin stood, I was struck by how isolated it felt. The cabin itself was small, built from rough-hewn logs that had darkened with age, and the roof sagged slightly. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, even though no one was supposed to be there yet. The surrounding forest was dense and quiet. There was a slight mist settling over the ground, giving the clearing an eerie stillness. I parked the car near the cabin and got out, stretching my legs and breathing deeply. The silence was profound. No birds, no insects, nothing except the distant sound of a stream I could barely see through the trees. I carried my backpack inside, noting the creak of the floorboards and the way the air smelled of old wood and faint mildew. The cabin had a main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen area with a sink and countertop, and a few shelves with basic supplies, some dishes, canned food, and a few bottles of water. There was a single bedroom with a bed covered in a thick, worn quilt. The bathroom was tiny but functional, with a small shower, toilet, and sink. Everything looked clean, but it was clearly old and rarely updated. After unpacking, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The forest around the cabin was dense, and the trees were tall and closely packed. I walked down a faint path I noticed near the edge of the clearing. It wound through the woods, occasionally opening into small clearings filled with ferns and moss. I found animal tracks, deer and raccoons mostly, but I also noticed deeper, heavier impressions that I couldn't immediately identify. My first thought was maybe a bear, though I had seen no signs of one recently. I made a mental note to be cautious, especially at night. The first night was unsettling. Even though I had camped before, being alone in such a remote place felt different. Every sound seemed amplified. The wind rustling through the treetops, branches snapping, leaves crunching under some unseen creature's weight. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just deer or raccoons moving about. I lit the fireplace and settled into a chair with a book. The fire cast flickering shadows on the walls, and every movement of the flames seemed to create shapes that disappeared when I blinked. Sleep didn't come easily, but eventually, I drifted off, leaving the fireplace smoldering. I woke several times during the night to strange sounds. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard a definite crunching of leaves, closer than before. It was subtle at first, intermittent, like someone or something was moving slowly through the underbrush. I stayed still, listening. The sound stopped, then resumed in another part of the clearing. My heart was racing, but I reminded myself that the forest was full of wildlife. I had seen the tracks during the day, and it was probably just an animal. Morning brought some relief. The sun broke through the mist, and the forest seemed calmer, though I remained uneasy. I decided to explore further. I followed a stream that ran behind the cabin, moving deeper into the forest. The terrain was uneven, and the ground was damp and slippery. After walking for nearly an hour, I stumbled upon a small, abandoned campsite. There were remnants of a fire pit, a few charred logs, and the torn remains of a tent. What caught my attention was the impression of several footprints in the mud, some too large to be mine. They were recent, judging by the moisture of the soil. I felt a pang of anxiety but shook it off. Perhaps someone else had been hiking in the area. The second night was worse. As dusk fell, the forest seemed to come alive. The wind picked up, and the sounds of animals grew louder and more chaotic. I noticed more of those heavy tracks around the cabin, some close to the porch. I moved quietly to the window, peering into the darkness, but couldn't see anything clearly. I tried to focus on the fireplace, keeping it burning brightly, thinking the light might deter anything from approaching. Hours passed with me sitting tensely in my chair, listening to the forest, until exhaustion finally forced me into bed. I slept fitfully. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a sharp, loud crack, like a tree branch snapping close to the cabin. I froze, straining to hear. There were more cracks, then the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps circling the cabin. My first instinct was fear, raw, undeniable fear, but I forced myself to think rationally. If someone was out there, it could be a hiker, maybe lost. But the thought of someone watching me from the darkness made my stomach turn. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly moved to the window, pointing the beam outside. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the forest edge. For a moment, I thought I saw a large shape moving. Then it vanished. I spent the rest of the night sitting upright, flashlight in hand, trying to track any movement outside. I noticed subtle signs. A broken branch here, a scuff in the dirt there. Whatever was out there, it was aware of me. I considered leaving immediately, but I was miles from the nearest road, and the nearest help would be far away. I decided to stay put until daylight, hoping that whoever, or whatever, was out there would retreat with the sun. Morning came, and with it a tense, oppressive calm. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. I stepped outside, inspecting the area around the cabin. The tracks were unmistakable now, large, heavy, not human. I realized with growing dread that a bear, or something similar, had been circling the cabin during the night. My mind raced. I had no weapons except for a small pocket knife, which was useless against a large predator. I remembered the old advice about making noise to deter wildlife, but the idea of wandering far from the cabin to find wood or tools was terrifying. Over the next 2 days, I focused on securing the cabin as best I could. I reinforced the doors and windows, piled logs around the perimeter for a makeshift barrier, and kept the fireplace roaring day and night. I avoided going into the forest except to gather water from the stream, which I did cautiously, scanning the area for movement constantly. Each night, the sounds returned: branches snapping, leaves crunching, heavy footsteps pacing around the clearing. I barely slept, dozing only for short intervals. The isolation, combined with the constant tension, began to wear me down physically and mentally. On the 4th day, I realized I needed a more reliable solution. I remembered the generator in the cabin and decided to set it up, hoping that the light and hum of it might keep anything at bay. Setting it up was exhausting. The engine was heavy, the fuel cans cumbersome. I carried everything outside, careful to make as little noise as possible. The moment I started the generator, a low growl came from the trees. My heart jumped, and I froze. The growl was deep and guttural, unmistakably animal. I pointed a flashlight toward the sound and saw it. A massive bear, standing on its hind legs at the edge of the clearing, easily 8 feet tall, with dark, matted fur and eyes locked on me. I felt frozen in place. I slowly backed toward the cabin, keeping my eyes on the bear. It didn't charge immediately, but it paced at the edge of the clearing, growling low. I realized that any sudden movement could provoke it. I managed to get inside, slamming the door behind me and bolting it as best I could. The bear circled the cabin for hours, growling and knocking against the walls with its weight. I stayed in the corner of the main room, flashlight and knife in hand, heart hammering, listening to every movement outside. The noise continued until late evening, when the bear finally retreated into the forest. I didn't sleep that night, too afraid to relax. By the 5th day, I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I packed what little I could, carefully making as little noise as possible. I waited for dawn, hoping that in the daylight the bear would be less bold. I took a path through the forest I had scouted earlier, sticking to the edges of clearings, moving slowly, constantly scanning for movement. I kept shouting and clapping intermittently, hoping to announce my presence and avoid startling the bear. Hours passed. My legs ached, and my pack felt heavier with every step. At one point, I stumbled and fell, cutting my knee on a rock. I paused, assessing the area for threats, before cleaning the wound and continuing. Eventually, I reached the dirt road I had taken to the cabin. Relief flooded me. I could see the path leading to the main road, where cars occasionally passed. I ran the last stretch, adrenaline giving me strength despite exhaustion and pain. When I finally reached a small gas station on the main road, I collapsed inside, trembling, my clothes torn and dirty, my knee bleeding. The attendant called the authorities, and soon I was being treated and questioned. The forest, the cabin, and the bear. All of it seemed unreal as I sat in the warmth and safety of the building, surrounded by people. In the days following, I couldn't shake the memory of the cabin and the bear circling it at night. I realized how fragile safety really is and how unprepared I had been for the realities of deep wilderness. The cabin trip had been intended as peaceful solitude, but it had become a test of survival, patience, and nerve. I learned, in the most brutal way, that the forest is not a place to be underestimated. Wildlife is unpredictable, and isolation magnifies fear. Looking back now, I understand that the trip was terrifying, but I also see it as a lesson in respect for nature. I was lucky to make it out unharmed, and the experience left me with a deep appreciation for the quiet, everyday safety of human settlements. The cabin still exists in the forest, standing silent and alone. I know that if I ever return, it will never be the same place in my mind. It will always be the place where fear was alive, tangible, and constant, and where every shadow could have been the last sight I ever saw. The experience changed how I view preparation, caution, and the thin line between solitude and danger in the wilderness. Even now, years later, when I hear about remote cabins or trips into dense forests, I feel the echo of that fear, and I remember the small but crucial things I learned. Always respect wildlife, always have a plan, and never underestimate the isolation of the forest. That cabin and that bear taught me lessons no book or video could ever convey. I survived, and I carried the memory with me, knowing that surviving something like that isn't just about luck. It's about awareness, patience, and maintaining calm when every instinct tells you to panic. The cabin still sits in the forest, and I have no desire to return. But the memory is sharp, clear, and real, and it reminds me every day of the fragility of human life when faced with the raw power of nature. That trip could have ended differently. I know that, but the ending I lived was one of survival, and though it was harrowing, it left me with clarity, respect, and a sense of accomplishment that is hard to describe. I had always been drawn to the quiet isolation of the woods, the way the forest seemed to hold its breath, as though time moved slower there. When I found the cabin online, it seemed perfect. A small wooden structure tucked away deep in the mountains, miles from the nearest town, with a stream running close by and trails that led further into the wilderness. The pictures were rustic but inviting, showing a hand-hewn cabin with a stone fireplace, a small porch overlooking the trees, and windows that reflected the late afternoon sun in a soft golden glow. The description promised solitude, a place to escape the noise and responsibilities of life, and for a while, I imagined myself spending a week there alone. Just me, the woods, and the silence. I arrived late on a Friday afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers through the trees. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of pine and damp earth. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt road that had long been overgrown in places. I had to park my car and walk the last few hundred meters along a narrow path littered with fallen branches and dry leaves that crunched underfoot. When I finally reached the cabin, it was even more secluded than I had imagined. There were no neighbors in sight, no sound of cars or human activity, just the forest, stretching endlessly in every direction. The cabin door was solid but aged, its wood warped slightly from years of weather. I fumbled with the key and finally managed to unlock it. The inside smelled of wood polish and faint mildew. Dust motes floated in the slanting light from the windows. The space was small but cozy, with a single room that contained a modest kitchenette, a table and a sofa, plus a small wood-burning stove in one corner. There was a loft for sleeping, accessible by a narrow ladder, and a tiny bathroom with a sink and shower. I set my bag down and took a moment to absorb the stillness, the profound quiet that felt both peaceful and unsettling. I spent the first evening unpacking and exploring. I found a stack of firewood near the stove and a few boxes of supplies that previous renters had left behind. Canned food, matches, a lantern, and a few bottles of water. The cabin had no electricity, no phone signal, and only a solar-powered light that provided a dim glow in the evenings. I lit the stove and made myself a simple dinner, the small flames throwing shadows across the walls. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and I could hear the faint gurgle of the stream nearby. It was calming at first, but as darkness fell, the sound seemed to grow sharper, almost too deliberate, like the forest was listening. That first night, I slept fitfully. The creaking of the cabin, the occasional snap of a branch outside, and the distant hoot of an owl made it hard to relax. Every sound was amplified in the silence, each one a reminder that I was completely alone. I kept telling myself it was normal, that forests made noises at night, that old cabins creaked. But when I woke in the middle of the night to a sudden thump from somewhere outside, like something heavy hitting the ground, I realized that the isolation made every ordinary sound feel ominous. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding trails. The map I had brought showed several paths winding through the woods, some leading to higher elevations, others to small ponds and rocky outcrops. I packed a small backpack with water, snacks, a flashlight, and a knife, just in case. The morning was bright, and the air smelled of pine resin and damp soil. Birds called to each other from the treetops, and a light breeze made the leaves shiver. I followed one trail that led uphill, the path narrow and overgrown. At first, it was peaceful, almost exhilarating to be so far from civilization. But as I climbed, I began to notice signs of something unusual. Broken branches littered the path, as if someone or something had pushed through them roughly. I spotted deep, irregular footprints in the mud, too large and uneven to be human. My heart started to race, but I told myself it was probably a deer or a bear. The forest felt alive in a way I hadn't expected, and I found myself constantly scanning the trees, listening for movement. Around midday, I reached a clearing that overlooked a valley. The view was breathtaking, but the sense of unease persisted. I took a few pictures, then turned back toward the cabin, trying to keep my mind occupied with ordinary things. When I returned, the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. I prepared a fire and ate a simple dinner. That night, I slept even less. Every small sound seemed magnified. The wind shaking the cabin, the stream rushing past, the occasional rustle of leaves. Around midnight, I heard it again, a heavy thump from outside, followed by the sound of branches snapping. My stomach knotted. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The noise came closer, then paused, and finally receded. I convinced myself it was just an animal, probably a bear, and that the distance was enough to keep me safe. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I decided to secure the cabin better. I stacked extra firewood against the door and checked the windows to make sure they were latched. I found a small, rusted old hunting rifle tucked in a corner of the cabin. I had no experience with guns, but I took it anyway just in case. I told myself it was precautionary. I spent the day doing chores around the cabin, cleaning, organizing supplies, and exploring the nearby stream. As the day wore on, the unease began to build. I noticed something odd. Tracks around the cabin, larger than human feet, pressed deep into the dirt and leaves. They were too regular to be a bear, and I couldn't imagine any other wild animal leaving such marks. By evening, the tension was unbearable. I barricaded the cabin door with heavy furniture and kept the rifle nearby. Every sound outside made me jump, and shadows seemed to move unnaturally across the walls. I stayed awake almost all night, listening, waiting, and hoping that I was imagining things. Around 3 a.m., I heard the noise again. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. Something was out there, pacing, waiting. I gripped the rifle, my hands shaking, but I couldn't see anything through the windows. I realized then that hiding wouldn't help me. I needed to leave. At first light, I packed my belongings quickly, leaving only the essentials. I double-checked that everything I needed was in my bag. Water, food, flashlight, and the rifle. I unlocked the door cautiously and stepped outside. The morning air was cold and sharp. The forest was quiet, too quiet, and I moved quickly toward my car, keeping my eyes on the shadows among the trees. Every crack of a branch made my heart race. I didn't look back until I reached the dirt road. Only then did I allow myself to breathe normally. Driving back down the overgrown path, I kept the windows rolled up and the doors locked. The sense of relief was overwhelming. The further I got from the cabin, the safer I felt, but the memory of those footsteps, those large, deliberate tracks, stayed with me. I never returned to that cabin. I reported it to the property owner, explaining that I had found the area unsafe, though I didn't mention everything I had seen. I knew they might not believe me. I avoided remote cabins after that, sticking to places closer to towns, where help was nearby if something went wrong. The experience stayed with me for years. I would remember it whenever I went hiking or camping, always checking the trees, always scanning the shadows. Even in crowded places, I sometimes felt a flicker of the same tension, a primal sense that someone or something was watching. But I also learned to trust my instincts, to respect the quiet and isolation of nature, and to always prepare for the unexpected. I realized that the forest is beautiful, but it is not forgiving. It is alive in ways that are both magnificent and terrifying, and when you are alone, it demands respect. The cabin remains in my memory as a place of fear and caution, but also of clarity. I survived because I listened to the small warnings, because I stayed alert, and because I trusted my own judgment over the illusion of comfort. It taught me something essential about isolation and survival, that sometimes the scariest things are not monsters or ghosts, but the real, tangible threats that exist in the world, waiting quietly, patiently, for the moment when someone lets their guard down. I had always liked being alone in the wilderness. The idea of escaping the city for a few days, away from the noise, the traffic, and the constant pressure of other people had always drawn me in. That's why I decided to rent a cabin deep in the forest for a week. It was autumn, the kind of late October weather where the air is crisp and cold, but the sun can still warm you for a few hours each day. The cabin was small, just enough for one person, tucked into a dense patch of pines and oaks, far enough from the main road that no one would bother me. The map said it was only a few miles from the nearest town, but the winding dirt road leading there made it feel like I was a world away. I packed my things carefully: food, water, clothes, a few books, and a small first aid kit. I had always been meticulous about planning when I went into the woods, and this time was no different. The drive there was uneventful, the only thing breaking the silence of the car being the occasional rustle of leaves along the roadside as small animals scurried away from my headlights. When I arrived, the cabin looked exactly like the photos online. Weathered wood, a small porch, a stone chimney, and a forest stretching in every direction. I parked my car, unloaded my bags, and took a long look at my surroundings. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. It was quiet in a way that almost felt unnatural, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I carried my things inside, set them down neatly, and walked through the small living space. A wood stove stood in the corner, a stack of firewood neatly piled next to it. There was a small table, 2 chairs, a couch, a simple bed in the back, and shelves filled with books. A few basic kitchen supplies were there: a small fridge, a kettle, some pots and pans. It wasn't luxurious, but it was comfortable. That first night, I made a fire in the stove, fed it with dry wood, and watched the flames crackle and die down slowly. I cooked a simple dinner, ate slowly, and then sat by the fire, reading a book until the light outside faded. By the time I went to bed, the darkness had settled completely over the forest. It wasn't the kind of darkness you see in a city, where lights always glow in the distance. This was the absolute blackness of deep woods, broken only by the occasional flicker of moonlight through the window or the faint shine of stars overhead. The first 2 days passed in a peaceful routine. I would wake early, make coffee on the stove, walk along the trails nearby, take photos of the forest, then return to the cabin to read, write, or just sit by the fire. I liked the solitude. It felt like I had everything in the world under control. The forest seemed alive, but in a quiet, almost lazy way. Birds called to each other, squirrels rustled in the underbrush, and the wind moved the trees in waves of shadow and light. At night, the sounds changed. I could hear branches snapping in the distance, maybe deer or other small animals moving about. Occasionally, I would hear the long, low groan of some larger animal moving through the trees, but it was always far away, and I never felt threatened. It was the third night that things started to feel different. I was sitting by the fire, reading, when I heard a sound outside that didn't fit with the usual forest noises. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sound was too deliberate. A footstep on gravel, slow and measured, coming from somewhere near the edge of the clearing around the cabin. I froze, listening. Then another step. I could feel my heart rate quicken, but I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the rhythm of the steps didn't match what I was used to. Animals usually made rapid, irregular noises. This was careful, slow, and purposeful. I stayed very still, watching the shadows outside the window. Nothing moved. I decided to ignore it. I had my fire, my books, and my small kitchen. There was no reason to panic. Still, I locked the doors and double-checked the windows before going to bed. I slept lightly that night, waking occasionally to listen. The footsteps never came closer, but there were sounds, branches breaking, leaves rustling, that I couldn't explain. The next day, I tried to keep busy. I hiked farther than before, taking a trail that followed a small creek. The air was colder now, the forest more silent in a way that was unsettling. I kept thinking about the night before, about the footsteps, but told myself that I was imagining things. There was no one here but me, and even if someone had been, they probably weren't a threat. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I looked into the trees, I felt like a shadow lingered just beyond my vision. That night, it got worse. Around 9 o'clock, I was sitting by the fire when I heard the sound again. This time, it was louder and closer. The slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps on gravel, moving around the cabin. I got up quietly and checked every window. I didn't see anyone. The sound circled the cabin, stopping for long pauses, then moving again. My stomach tightened, and I realized I had no cell service. My car was parked a few hundred feet away, but in the dark, I wouldn't be able to reach it quickly if something happened. I started thinking about ways to protect myself. The cabin had a small knife in the kitchen, and I had a small axe for chopping wood. I decided I would stay awake and watch for any movement. Hours passed like this. I stayed near the stove, fire bright, axe in hand, eyes on the windows. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves, made my heart jump. I saw movement at one point, a figure, but it vanished before I could be sure. I convinced myself it was a trick of light, but the fear didn't go away. By the time morning came, I hadn't slept a full hour. I felt exhausted, tense, and more aware than I had ever been in my life. The morning brought some relief. I saw no tracks around the cabin, no sign of anyone there. I tried to relax, telling myself it was probably just someone passing through, or my imagination. I hiked a little that day, carrying the axe with me just in case. I even thought about leaving, but the dirt road was long, and I didn't want to risk driving in the dark if someone was really nearby. The isolation that had been peaceful before now felt dangerous. The fourth night was the worst. Around 10 o'clock, I was lying in bed, pretending to sleep, when I heard a noise outside my bedroom window. Something scraping against the wood siding. I froze. My mind raced. I remembered stories I had read about people being attacked in isolated cabins, how someone could hide for hours and watch before moving in. My heart pounded so loudly I thought the intruder might hear it. I gripped the knife tightly, listening. The scraping continued slowly along the side of the cabin, moving closer to the back, then stopping. I stayed still, waiting, trying to make no sound. Then, after a long silence, the scraping moved away. I couldn't take it anymore. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting on the bed with the knife and axe within reach. listening to every sound. When the first light of dawn came, I cautiously stepped outside. I looked around the perimeter of the cabin. There were footprints in the dirt, large boots circling the cabin. Whoever it was had been careful to avoid leaving tracks that led directly to the road. They had been watching, waiting. I took pictures of the prints for evidence, my hands shaking. I knew I had to leave. I packed my things quickly, keeping my eyes on the tree-line, scanning for movement. I carried the axe in one hand, knife in the other. My car was parked where I left it, engine cold, keys ready. I got inside and locked the doors. I started the car slowly, checking the forest all around me. Then I drove off, down the winding dirt road, watching the shadows. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, a paved stretch with houses and traffic. Only then did I feel some relief. I didn't return to that cabin. Later, I reported the footprints to the local authorities, and they said it wasn't unusual for isolated cabins to be visited by people scouting them, sometimes with bad intentions. I never found out who or what had been circling that cabin, and I never went back to that part of the forest. The experience stayed with me for months. I started to understand how quickly peace and solitude can turn into fear when isolation makes you vulnerable. Looking back, I realized that preparation helped me survive. I had basic weapons, food, water, and a plan. I stayed calm enough to assess the situation and act when it was necessary. And I never let myself underestimate the danger that can exist in quiet, empty places. The forest itself was not my enemy. The danger was human, hidden in the shadows, patient, observing. That knowledge stayed with me, the most lasting lesson of all. I still visit the wilderness sometimes, but never alone. I carry more than I need, I stay connected, and I avoid cabins that are completely isolated. That week in the forest taught me about fear, vigilance, and survival in a way no book ever could. I survived because I was aware, cautious, and ready to act. And the relief I felt when I finally reached safety was something I will never forget. I had been driving for hours, the sun dipping low over the distant ridges as I followed the winding forest road that led to the cabin I had rented for the weekend. The idea of escaping the city and its constant noise and pressure had been irresistible. I wanted quiet, isolation, the kind that allowed my mind to rest, maybe even reset. I had planned everything meticulously. Packed extra food, a first aid kit, plenty of water, a portable stove, blankets, and a flashlight with extra batteries. The cabin was described online as rustic but sturdy, set deep in the woods near a small, clear lake. I imagined sitting on the porch, watching the water shimmer at dusk, feeling the sun slip away behind the mountains. It was exactly what I wanted, or so I thought. The road was rough, lined with trees so dense that the late afternoon sun barely touched the asphalt. My phone signal had vanished long before I reached the turnoff, leaving me relying solely on the GPS device I had brought along. Even that flickered occasionally, which left me uneasy, but I told myself it was part of the adventure. After nearly 2 hours of jostling along narrow, uneven roads, I spotted the cabin. A modest wooden structure tucked into a small clearing, smoke curling faintly from the chimney. The sight was comforting. The road behind me disappeared entirely into the forest, like it had never existed. The moment I stepped out of the car, the forest swallowed me with its thick, almost suffocating quiet. Birds chirped faintly somewhere above, but there was no breeze, no rustle of small animals, only the soft crack of twigs under my boots. I unlocked the cabin door and stepped inside. The smell of aged wood, faintly musty but not unpleasant, greeted me. The cabin was sparse. A small kitchen area, a table with 2 chairs, a wood stove, a couch with threadbare cushions, and a loft above that served as a sleeping area. There were no other people, and for a moment that was perfect. The isolation felt like a blanket, heavy and comforting. I unpacked my things slowly, laying out food, blankets, and water. I checked the stove, made sure the firewood was dry, and even lit a small fire to shake off the chill that had crept in with the evening. As the fire crackled, I wandered to the windows and stared at the lake through the thick trees. The water reflected the last reds and golds of the sunset, still and deep. The quiet felt almost sacred. I made myself a cup of tea and settled onto the couch, the warmth of the fire spreading through my chest, and I felt the tension of city life finally loosen. Night came quickly. The forest seemed to exhale around the cabin, and the shadows grew long and heavy. I went to the loft to sleep, tucking myself under a thick blanket. The first hours passed uneventfully, but as midnight approached, I began to notice subtle sounds that had escaped me in the firelight. The occasional snap of a branch, a distant rustle, the heavy tread of something moving through leaves far from the cabin. My imagination tried to frame these noises as wildlife, deer, raccoons, maybe a fox, but the sounds had a rhythm, a deliberateness that unsettled me. I forced myself to sleep, but my rest was fitful. When I woke again, it was still dark, and the forest pressed against the cabin like a living wall. Something made me look toward the front door, a sense of being watched crawling over my skin. The porch creaked under a weight that shouldn't have been there, and I realized my mind had been jumping at shadows. I got up and checked the perimeter of the cabin as best as I could with my flashlight. Nothing, just trees, rocks, and the dark shapes of the forest floor. The next morning, I decided I needed a reason to leave the cabin for a while. I gathered my hiking gear and made my way down the narrow path toward the lake. The walk was longer than I expected. The forest floor was thick with fallen leaves, roots, and uneven stones. Every few minutes I had to pause and catch my breath, both from the exertion and the growing sense of unease that seemed to cling to me. When I finally reached the lake, the water was still, colder than I had imagined, and eerily clear. Fish darted beneath the surface, and a single heron stood on the far bank, frozen in place. I stood there for a while, letting the sunlight warm my back, feeling a momentary peace. Returning to the cabin, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. My car, parked exactly where I had left it, had a single scratch along the side. Not deep, but enough to catch the light. I ran my fingers along the mark, the wood of the cabin suddenly feeling more fragile than it had the night before. I told myself it was probably a branch from the trees brushing the side of the car during the night. The forest was full of potential hazards, after all. But my mind refused to settle. That evening, the sense of unease escalated. While preparing dinner, I heard something moving around the perimeter of the cabin. Not the distant snaps from before, closer. Intentional. Heavy steps. I froze, listening. Then the sound stopped. Minutes passed. I convinced myself it was a deer or some other animal. But I knew deep down that the rhythm didn't match any wildlife I had ever encountered. My imagination tried to rationalize it, but the rationalization felt thin. I decided to stay in the loft for the night. I locked the door, although the lock was a simple latch, and I placed the fire poker across it for extra security. Sleep came, but I woke several times to scratching noises, faint at first, growing louder, circling the cabin. Something had been outside. Something big, moving carefully, deliberately. My mind raced. The thought of an animal, a bear, or even a human intruder made my skin crawl. The morning light was a relief, but the tension lingered. I decided I needed to leave. I packed quickly, grabbing everything I had brought. Then I saw it. Footprints in the soft soil near the back of the cabin. Too large for any small animal, human-sized. My heart raced. The tracks led into the forest and stopped abruptly. No other traces, just nothing. I ran to the car and inspected it further. The scratch was deeper, fresh. Someone had been there, watched me while I slept. I drove away without hesitation, the forest shrinking in the rearview mirror, my senses on high alert for any sign that I was being followed. It was only when I reached a paved road, with other cars passing by and cell phone signal returning, that I allowed myself to breathe again. I reported the incident to the local authorities, giving them the cabin's location and describing the scratch and footprints. They told me these incidents weren't unheard of in remote areas. Sometimes poachers, sometimes people looking for a place to hide, sometimes just strange intrusions into remote areas. Weeks later, I returned to the cabin under daylight and with the authorities accompanying me. The scratches were gone, the tracks faded, but the cabin, once a place of peace and solitude, now felt tainted. The forest itself seemed unchanged, yet I knew the isolation, the stillness, could hide dangers that were very real. I stayed only briefly, ensuring that no one was living in the woods illegally, and left the cabin behind me, knowing that some places, no matter how picturesque, could harbor threats that were invisible until it was almost too late. I learned to respect solitude in a new way. Nature is beautiful and restorative, but isolation in the wrong circumstances can become frightening in the most realistic and immediate sense. I carry the lesson with me now. Preparation matters, vigilance matters, and the world outside the city can be utterly indifferent, or even dangerous, in ways no website or rental description will ever warn you about. I had been planning this trip for months. The city had grown suffocating, and I needed to get away, to find some quiet in the woods where the noise of people, traffic, and constant hum of machines didn't exist. I found a cabin online, secluded, miles from the nearest road, with a description promising privacy and peace. The photos showed a small wooden structure, rustic but intact, surrounded by trees that seemed to swallow the cabin entirely, with only a narrow path leading up to it. I booked it, packed my gear, and left in the late morning, hoping to reach it by evening. The drive itself was uneventful at first. The city gave way to suburban roads, which slowly turned into narrow country lanes. By the time I turned onto the dirt path that led to the cabin, I realized how isolated the place really was. The sun was low, and the shadows of the trees stretched long across the ground. The air smelled different out here, cleaner, sharper, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. I parked the car in a small clearing near the cabin and took a moment to stretch. The silence was almost complete. There were no birds, no wind, no distant engines. Just a quiet, almost pressing stillness that made my skin crawl slightly. The cabin itself was exactly as advertised. A simple wooden structure, about 2 rooms, with a small kitchen area and a loft above that I assumed served as a bedroom. The door opened easily, and inside, the air was cooler, musty with old wood and a faint hint of mold. I set my bag down and began inspecting the place. The windows were intact, though dusty, and the fireplace in the corner looked like it hadn't been used in a while. I found a stack of firewood outside and decided I would make a fire to warm up the place once night fell. As I unpacked, I noticed how quiet it was. Not the comfortable quiet you might find in a park or a countryside retreat, but a heavy quiet, almost alive in its stillness. I told myself it was just because I was alone, and that alone wasn't frightening, it was freeing. I set up my sleeping bag in the loft, arranged my supplies in the kitchen, and prepared a simple dinner. The sun dipped behind the trees, casting long, dark shadows across the ground, and I felt a subtle shift in the air, like the forest itself was holding its breath. After dinner, I decided to explore the surroundings. I walked down the narrow path that led deeper into the woods, shining my flashlight over the underbrush. The trees were tall, dense, and pressed close together, branches almost forming a roof overhead. My flashlight revealed nothing but more trees, leaves on the ground, and a few rocks scattered along the path. I walked for maybe 30 minutes before realizing I had no real destination, no trail markers, and that the forest was beginning to feel endless. I turned back, convincing myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. That night, I lit the fireplace and settled in with a book. The cabin creaked as the fire burned, the old wood contracting and settling. Outside, I thought I heard something moving, maybe an animal, but when I went to check, I saw nothing. The wind was picking up, brushing against the windows and making the branches scrape softly on the walls. I shook off the unease, telling myself I was imagining things. I fell asleep on the loft, the fire burning low, the silence pressing down in a way that was almost physical. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound that made my heart stop, the front door creaking. My first thought was that the wind had caught it, but when I sat up, I saw the door slowly opening, inch by inch. Panic shot through me, and I froze. I had checked the locks earlier. They were secure. My mind raced through possibilities. Animals, thieves, some stranger somehow finding their way here. I stayed completely still, listening. The wind had dropped. Everything was silent except the faint sound of the door moving. I grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace and crept down the stairs, careful not to make a sound. The door had stopped moving. I reached it and cautiously stepped outside. Nothing. The clearing was empty, the car untouched. I checked the locks again and made sure the windows were secured. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, sitting by the fire, heart pounding, unable to shake the feeling that someone or something was watching. Morning came, though I barely slept. I tried to rationalize everything. The old hinges on the door, the way the wind had shifted, maybe even an animal that had managed to move it. I decided I needed to stay alert and organized my day. I collected firewood, inspected the cabin thoroughly, and even scouted the immediate perimeter. Everything looked normal, yet the tension never left me. The second night was worse. Around 2 a.m., I heard noises outside again. Footsteps, this time heavy and deliberate. I knew the forest, the soft layer of fallen leaves, the way dirt would crunch. This wasn't an animal. It was human. I grabbed my flashlight and the poker again, ready to confront whoever was out there. I turned it on, sweeping the beam over the clearing. The trees stood motionless. No one. I thought I saw a shadow move at the edge of the light, but when I focused, nothing was there. I stayed awake all night, listening to the occasional snap of twigs, feeling the oppressive weight of being alone and vulnerable in the middle of the woods. By the third day, I realized I was not just uneasy. I was trapped in a place where every sound, every shadow, every creak of the cabin became amplified. I couldn't go anywhere without fear. My food supply was limited, my phone had no signal, and the nearest road was miles away. I began to ration my movements, staying inside, moving only between the kitchen, the loft, and the fire area. I became hyper-aware of every sound. The wind, the animals, the faintest footstep outside. I began to imagine patterns where there were none, convinced that someone was watching, waiting for me to leave the cabin alone. One evening, I noticed the car tire tracks near the cabin. Not old tracks, fresh ones. Someone had driven down the narrow path and parked nearby, maybe an hour ago. I froze, my mind racing. I had seen no car arrive. The tracks didn't belong to me. Panic rose like a tide. I went inside and locked every possible entry, barricading the door with the furniture I could move. My imagination ran wild. I knew the reality. Someone had found the cabin, had access, and was now potentially lurking somewhere nearby. I decided I had to leave, but I couldn't go blindly. I packed my bag, grabbed my fire poker, a hatchet from the kitchen, and some water. I waited until it was nearly dark. The sun was low, and the shadows grew long and dark. I carefully opened the door a crack and scanned the clearing. Nothing moved. The forest stood quiet. I began my walk down the path toward the nearest road, stepping softly, listening intently. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig sent me into a surge of adrenaline. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, I saw the faint glint of the road through the trees. Relief surged through me. I broke into a jog, then a sprint, the adrenaline pushing me forward. Behind me, I thought I heard a footstep, but when I glanced back, nothing was there. My heart raced, my lungs burned, but I kept moving. The road finally opened up in front of me, and I collapsed onto the asphalt, exhausted, trembling, and utterly drained. A car passed by after a while, slowing when it saw me on the side of the road. I waved frantically and they pulled over. I explained in halting gasps that I had been staying in a cabin nearby, that I was being followed, and that I needed help. They called the authorities, and a search of the area found evidence of someone having been near the cabin. A few items left behind, a hidden campsite not far from where I had been staying, but no one was caught. It was never clear who had been watching me, why they had targeted this isolated cabin, or how close I had actually come to danger. I never returned to that cabin. The experience stayed with me, vivid and raw, a reminder of how isolation can strip away your sense of safety, how quickly quiet can become threatening, and how fragile the illusion of control is when you are alone in a place no one else can reach. Even months later, When I think about the trees pressing close, the silence that seemed alive, and the shadow of someone unseen lurking just beyond sight, I can feel the chill run through my body. I still go into the woods sometimes, but never that deep, never that isolated. I've learned to respect the quiet, to pay attention to the signs, to trust instinct, and above all, to know that even in a place that seems peaceful, danger can arrive quietly, unexpectedly, and without warning. I had planned the trip for months. The cabin was deep in the northern woods, far from the nearest town, perched on a small clearing beside a lake. I needed to get away from everything: emails, notifications, responsibilities. Just me, the quiet, and the forest. I drove for hours, following a narrow, winding road that eventually disappeared into gravel and dirt, surrounded by thick pine and fir trees. The air changed as I went further in, cooler and sharper, scented with damp earth and pine sap. When I finally reached the cabin, the late afternoon sun was dipping low, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin itself was small, wooden, with a steep roof and a stone chimney. It looked abandoned at first glance, but the porch was swept clean, and the windows gleamed faintly, as if someone had polished them recently. I parked my car to the side, unlocked the heavy wooden door, and stepped inside. The interior was rustic, minimalistic, but sturdy. There was a fireplace, a small kitchen with basic supplies, and a lofted sleeping area. A thin layer of dust covered most surfaces, except where it was clear someone had been keeping the place tidy. After setting down my bags, I unpacked slowly, arranging things in the small kitchen and making a cup of instant coffee. I wanted to watch the sunset from the porch, so I carried my cup outside. The lake was calm, almost glass-like, reflecting the orange and pink sky. Birds chirped intermittently, and the forest was quiet, almost too quiet. I felt a subtle unease, like I was being watched, but I shook it off. That was just my mind. There was no one else here. I was alone. The first night was mostly peaceful. I made a small fire in the fireplace, read a book, and eventually drifted off to sleep in the loft. Around midnight, I woke to a snapping sound outside. It was soft, deliberate, almost like a branch breaking under weight. I froze, listening. The wind rustled the trees, but the snap repeated, faint, coming from the far edge of the clearing. My heart rate increased. I reminded myself that it could be a deer, a raccoon, something normal. Still, I stayed awake for hours, lying under the thin blanket, listening to the forest sounds. The snapping continued intermittently, never consistent, never close enough to see clearly. The next morning, I explored the surroundings. I walked along the lake, finding footprints in the mud. At first, I thought they were animal tracks, but as I followed them, they looked oddly human-sized. I froze when I realized that the prints weren't just near the lake. They led into the forest, coming toward the cabin and stopping at the tree line. There were no leaves or twigs crushed except for the prints themselves, as if someone had deliberately walked lightly to avoid leaving much evidence. I scanned the trees. Nothing moved, no shadows shifted. I went back to the cabin, heart hammering. I didn't sleep much that day. By the third day, my unease had turned into something heavier, almost suffocating. The woods felt alive with movement, though I saw nothing. At night, I kept hearing faint knocks on the cabin walls. Sometimes it was a soft rapping on the wood near the window, other times on the door. I refused to open it, but I began barricading the windows with chairs, moving furniture in front of doors. I stocked my kitchen knives, making sure they were within reach, and checked the fireplace and stove for heavy objects I could use to defend myself if necessary. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, but the sound of footsteps circling the cabin at night made it impossible to convince myself. One evening, I went to check the back of the cabin. I had brought a flashlight, sweeping it over the clearing. There were more footprints now, leading from the tree line to the back porch. They looked fresh. They were too big to be a child, too deliberate to be an animal. I felt an intense pressure in my chest, a combination of fear and adrenaline. I hurried back inside, locking everything and sitting against the door. That night, the footsteps were louder. I could hear someone or something moving deliberately around the cabin, circling it like a predator. Every now and then, there was a pause, as if whoever it was listening, waiting. The next morning, I decided I needed to leave, but when I went to the driveway, I found my car's tires slashed. Panic surged. My heart raced uncontrollably. There was no cell service here. The cabin was isolated, and the nearest road was miles away. I checked the windows and doors again. Everything seemed intact, though the footprints around the cabin were more pronounced now, suggesting someone had been moving around while I slept. I grabbed the small emergency radio I had packed, hoping for some news, but there was only static. I spent the rest of the day preparing. I gathered food, water, and any tools I could use to defend myself. I made sure the firewood pile was accessible and checked the knives and axes. The cabin felt smaller, suffocating, every sound outside amplified. By evening, I could hear someone walking in the clearing again. This time, there was no mistaking it. Footsteps crunching in the dead leaves, circling, stopping, then moving again. I pressed myself against the wall, eyes fixed on the windows, listening. I could see movement shadows outside, slight flickers that suggested someone, or multiple people, were pacing the perimeter. I realized I had to escape. Staying in the cabin was too dangerous. But the forest was thick, and the nearest main road was at least 3 miles away on foot, through trails I hadn't memorized. I decided to wait until nightfall and use the darkness to move quietly. I prepared a backpack with essentials: water, food, a flashlight, knives, a rope. I would move cautiously, sticking to the trees, keeping to shadows. I told myself this was survival, nothing else mattered. Night fell and I made my move. The forest was black, the moon barely visible through the thick canopy. I moved quietly, crouched low, avoiding twigs and branches that might snap. Every rustle of leaves, every distant animal sound, made me jump. After what felt like hours, I came across a faint dirt trail that might lead to the main road. I followed it cautiously, moving slowly, listening. The footsteps around the cabin didn't follow me immediately, but I felt certain I was being tracked. I wasn't wrong. At one point, I heard a low snapping sound behind me, like a branch being broken under deliberate pressure. I froze, pressed myself against a tree, and waited. After several minutes, the sound faded, and I continued cautiously. I walked through the night, exhausted and terrified, until I finally emerged onto a gravel road just before dawn. I saw a car approaching in the distance and waved my flashlight frantically. The driver stopped, a middle-aged man who looked at me, startled. I ran toward the car, panting and shaking, and explained as much as I could. He listened, silent, then offered to drive me to the nearest town. On the way, I kept glancing back at the forest, hoping I was finally safe. Once I reached town, I reported the incident to the local sheriff. They took my statement seriously, noting that the cabin had been used recently by squatters who had been following the area, targeting isolated properties. They reassured me that patrols would increase, and eventually the cabin would be monitored and cleared. It wasn't a story of ghosts or monsters, but the fear was real, the danger tangible. I learned that the forest could hide people with intent to harm, and isolation amplified fear in ways that the mind alone couldn't create. Weeks later, I returned briefly to check on the cabin under supervision of law enforcement. They had cleared it, the squatters were gone, and the property was safe, at least for now. I walked through the rooms carefully, noticing small signs that someone had been there. Scratches on the floor, remnants of food, and areas that had clearly been disturbed. I felt a mixture of relief and lingering unease, but I finally understood the gravity of what I had survived. The forest wasn't magical. It wasn't haunted. It was real, and the danger had been real. I never returned to that cabin alone. I started camping only in public campgrounds, always near other people, always with means to communicate. But the memory of those footsteps circling the cabin, the shattered silence of the forest at night, and the sheer isolation stayed with me. I realized fear isn't always about the supernatural. Sometimes, it's the very real knowledge that something with intent could be just out of sight, watching, waiting. And that awareness changed the way I approached the woods forever. I became meticulous in my preparations for any trip into isolation. Maps, emergency radios, extra supplies, and always a plan for escape. I studied survival techniques more seriously, not for adventure, but for safety. That cabin taught me to respect isolation, to respect the wilderness, and to acknowledge that danger could be human, tangible, and calculated. The fear I experienced was raw, immediate, and unforgettable, but surviving it gave me something I hadn't expected: a clarity about preparedness, awareness, and the unpredictable nature of being alone in the woods. Years later, I still think about that cabin. I know I was lucky. Every decision, every precaution, every step I took during that night and the following days mattered. And in some ways, the ordeal gave me a kind of resilience. I never forgot the terror, but I also never forgot the clarity and focus it forced upon me. In the end, I survived because I remained alert, cautious, and willing to act decisively. That survival wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, careful, and entirely grounded in reality. And that was the lesson the cabin left me with. Fear is real, danger is real, but preparation, awareness, and action can be just as real. And sometimes that is enough to make the ending clear, safe, and undeniable. I never thought I would find myself in the middle of nowhere, alone in a cabin I barely knew, surrounded by nothing but forest and silence. The drive there had been long, winding through narrow mountain roads that barely felt safe even in daylight. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already low, stretching long shadows across the uneven terrain, painting the forest in muted orange and brown. I remember feeling an odd mixture of excitement and unease. It was supposed to be a simple weekend escape, a break from work and city noise. I had imagined quiet nights, the smell of pine, and mornings with frost on the windows. But the moment I opened the car door, the cold wind that swept over me was sharper than I expected, biting through my jacket and reminding me how isolated I truly was. The cabin itself was small, built from rough, dark wood that had weathered countless winters. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and a few of the windows rattled when the wind picked up. The front porch had a layer of dead leaves that crunched beneath my boots. I remember pausing there, just looking at it, and feeling a strange tension building inside me. Something about the place seemed off. Not the building itself, but the way it sat in the forest, almost swallowed by it. There was no path leading to the cabin, just a narrow track carved into the undergrowth, and the woods around it seemed unnaturally thick. Even during the day, I noticed how little sunlight reached the ground under the dense canopy. The forest felt alive, almost watchful. I started by inspecting the inside of the cabin. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the air smelled of damp wood and dust. There was a small kitchen area with a rusted sink and a cast iron stove that had probably not been used in months. A single bedroom with a rickety bed frame and a thin mattress faced a window that looked out into the forest. I set my bag down and decided to unpack a few essentials. The cabin had electricity, but it was unreliable. There were a few flickering bulbs, and the hum of a generator in the distance suggested that power was not continuous. The first night, I made a small fire in the stove to ward off the chill. I stacked dry wood from the shed outside and watched the flames crawl over the logs. It was comforting at first, the warmth and the crackling sound. But as the night deepened, the wind picked up, howling through the cracks in the cabin's walls. Every creak, every shift of the old wood made me flinch. I kept telling myself it was normal, that the house was old, that the wind was strong, but my heart rate refused to calm down. The second day, I explored the area around the cabin. I followed the narrow track deeper into the forest, stepping over fallen branches and thick undergrowth. The further I went, the quieter it became. Even birds seemed absent. Occasionally, I would hear a distant rustle or the crack of a branch underfoot, and my stomach would tighten. I found a small creek a short distance from the cabin, its water running clear and cold. I knelt by the edge and filled a bottle, noticing how isolated it felt. No signs of human activity, no trash, no sounds except for the water and the occasional bird high in the trees. The forest was beautiful in a way that made the skin on the back of my neck prickle. It was raw and alive, but also indifferent. I walked back slowly, taking note of landmarks so I could find my way, though I didn't feel fully comfortable leaving the cabin for too long. By the third night, unease had begun to grow into anxiety. The wind was stronger, and the trees seemed to lean closer to the cabin, their branches scraping against the roof and walls. Shadows inside the cabin shifted unnaturally, and every sound was amplified. When I moved around, I could hear the floorboards groaning, sometimes in places I hadn't stepped. It was a sound that made me pause, forcing me to listen for a moment too long, trying to convince myself it was normal. I checked the doors and windows several times, making sure they were locked. The isolation made the mind wander. I began noticing things I had ignored before. Faint scratches near the window frames, footprints in the mud outside that I couldn't explain, small piles of leaves near the door arranged in ways that didn't feel natural. I tried to rationalize it. It was the wind, animals, but a part of me could not ignore the feeling that I was being watched. Sleep was difficult. I lay on the thin mattress listening to the wind and the strange, subtle noises of the cabin. Sometimes I thought I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin. I would freeze, straining to listen, waiting for a sound I could identify. Nothing ever came, but the tension lingered, gnawing at me. I kept a kitchen knife under my pillow, a small gesture of protection that made me feel slightly safer. Morning brought some relief, the daylight cutting through the darkness and shadows, but the unease persisted. The isolation was oppressive. I could go for hours without seeing another human or hearing a vehicle. The forest was alive, but only with its own logic. On the fourth day, I decided to explore further, thinking that understanding the surrounding terrain might ease my anxiety. I packed essentials, water, food, a flashlight, and a small first aid kit, and started walking along a less defined path that ran parallel to the creek I had found earlier. After an hour, the path became almost invisible, swallowed by thick bushes and fallen trees. I realized that I had wandered further than intended. The forest was denser here, and the canopy blocked almost all sunlight. Every step required careful footing, avoiding roots and rocks. That's when I saw it. Fresh footprints in the mud. Not animal tracks, but human. They were deep, showing a heavy step, and they didn't match mine or any previous prints I had seen. My heart jumped. I scanned the area, trying to see if someone was watching, but there was no one, just the thick, silent forest. I debated turning back, but curiosity and fear mingled into a tense focus, forcing me to keep following them. They led deeper, winding through dense undergrowth, until I realized I was completely off the trail. Panic began to set in as I noticed that the prints stopped abruptly near a large fallen tree. No one had passed beyond it. My stomach tightened. I turned back, retracing my steps slowly, my eyes constantly scanning for movement. The forest had changed in mood. It felt heavier, more suffocating. The sun was dipping lower, shadows stretching, and I hurried back, hearing nothing but my own ragged breathing and the distant rush of the creek. That evening, as I settled back in the cabin, I began noticing small details I hadn't before. Items inside the cabin seemed shifted. The kitchen towel I had left folded neatly was now hanging off the counter. A chair that had been pushed against the wall was slightly askew. I didn't want to believe it, telling myself it could be the wind or an animal, but the thought of someone else being in the cabin terrified me. I went through the cabin meticulously, checking every corner, every window. I found nothing, but the fear didn't leave. I started sleeping fully clothed, with shoes by the bed and the knife in my hand. Every sound outside made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move with intent. The forest felt alive in a way that was no longer beautiful, it was predatory. The fifth day brought rain. It started lightly, a steady drizzle that became heavier by afternoon. I watched from the window as sheets of water ran down the roof and pooled around the cabin. The creek swelled, rushing faster than before, carrying leaves and debris. I stayed inside, feeling trapped, the storm amplifying my isolation. That evening, after the rain had slowed, I noticed footprints outside, right at the edge of the porch. They were wet as if made during the rain. My pulse quickened. They didn't belong to me. I pressed my back against the wall, heart hammering, watching the faint light fade outside. The idea that someone might have approached the cabin while I was inside made me feel sick. I thought about leaving immediately, but the storm had made the forest muddy and slippery. I could not risk moving through it in the dark. I decided to wait, staying alert through the night. The night was long. Rain continued sporadically, and the wind howled through the trees. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside, sent me into tense vigilance. I stayed in the main room with the stove going, surrounded by shadows and the smell of wet wood. Around midnight, the rain stopped, leaving a heavy silence. That silence was worse than the storm. I could hear the forest breathing, the wind in the higher trees, the occasional drip of water from leaves. I noticed something strange on the floor near the window. Small scratches in the wood, as if someone had tried to peer inside. My hands shook as I examined them. They were recent. I realized that the feeling I had ignored for days was real. Someone had been near, watching me, close enough to touch. I stayed awake the rest of the night, knife ready, listening to every sound. The following morning, I decided I had to leave. Staying was no longer safe. The forest felt like a trap. I packed quickly, checked every corner of the cabin one last time, and loaded my car. As I started down the narrow track, I saw signs of movement in the mud, footprints following me from the cabin, stopping just at the edge of the trees. I didn't look back, driving as fast as I could along the winding road, heart hammering, eyes scanning constantly. The cabin disappeared behind me, swallowed by the forest, but the feeling lingered. The awareness that someone had been there, close enough to observe, close enough to follow, even if they hadn't tried to confront me directly. It was a reminder of how vulnerable I had been in isolation, how quickly the forest could conceal threats, and how easily fear could take hold when the mind is left alone in silence and darkness. I reached a town hours later, exhausted and shaken. I reported the cabin to the local authorities, who mentioned occasional break-ins in remote areas but couldn't confirm anyone being there that weekend. I never returned to that cabin, and I never will. Even now, I remember the way the trees pressed in, the wind that felt like it carried more than just leaves, and the quiet that was heavier than any noise. It wasn't ghosts or shadows. It was human, real, and terrifyingly close. The experience stayed with me for years. I learned that isolation in nature isn't just peaceful. It can be dangerous in ways that no horror story can truly capture. The forest doesn't need to move to scare you. It simply needs to exist while you're alone in it. I realized that safety is not about imagination, but preparation and awareness. I made sure that every trip into remote areas afterward was meticulously planned, never alone, and always with multiple ways to communicate and escape. That cabin taught me a lesson in vigilance, in respect for solitude, and in the subtle, real dangers that can hide behind the serene beauty of nature. Even months later, when I closed my eyes, I could feel the weight of that forest pressing down, reminding me how close fear can get when you are utterly alone. I never forgot that cabin, the isolation, the footprints, the scratches, or the nights spent listening to the forest as if it were alive and waiting. And I never will. I had been driving for hours through winding roads surrounded by dense pine forests. The sun was low in the sky, and the long shadows of the trees stretched across the cracked asphalt like fingers reaching out for me. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, as the tires crunched over fallen branches and patches of gravel. I had been planning this cabin trip for months, desperate to escape the noise and exhaustion of the city. The cabin I rented was in a remote part of the forest, far from any other homes or towns. The owner had assured me it was perfect for solitude, with nothing around for miles except wilderness. That had sounded ideal when I first booked it, but now, as darkness began to fall and the forest seemed to press in on both sides of the road, it began to feel like something else entirely. The directions the owner had sent were vague, but I followed them carefully, turning left at the fallen oak, then right after the creek that smelled faintly of stagnant water. My headlights cut narrow paths through the darkness, illuminating thick fog that had begun rolling in. I felt a sudden cold draft through the slightly open window and instinctively rolled it up. The forest around me felt heavy, as though it was waiting for me, holding its breath. I told myself it was just the quiet of being alone, the isolation, but the sensation did not go away. Finally, I saw it. A small wooden cabin tucked into a clearing. The structure was older than I expected, with darkened logs and a roof sagging slightly under what must have been years of neglect. A thin trail of smoke rose from the chimney, almost making me wonder if someone else was there. But the surrounding silence suggested otherwise. The sun was almost gone, leaving just a dim twilight glow behind the dense trees. I parked and got out, the crunch of gravel under my boots loud in the eerie stillness. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, echoing in the empty cabin. Inside, the air was musty, smelling of damp wood and old stone. There were basic furnishings: a small wooden table, a couple of chairs, a bed in the corner, and a fireplace with soot still clinging to the bricks. I set my backpack down and went to explore the rest of the cabin. The kitchen was tiny, with a cold sink and a few old dishes stacked neatly. A small window overlooked the dark forest, and as I looked out, I thought I saw movement among the trees. I shook my head and told myself it was my imagination, probably a deer or a fox. I spent the next hour unpacking and trying to make the cabin feel livable. I lit a few candles I had brought, since the electricity apparently did not work, and started a small fire in the fireplace. The flickering flames cast shadows that danced across the walls, making the cabin feel alive in an almost threatening way. I ate a quick dinner from my pack and tried to relax, but the sense of being watched did not go away. Every time I glanced at the window, I swore I could see something move just beyond the trees. Around 10 o'clock, I went to check the perimeter of the cabin. The forest was nearly black, and I had to use a flashlight to see more than a few feet ahead. The beam cut through the fog, revealing gnarled roots and fallen branches, but nothing else. I circled the cabin slowly, stepping carefully over uneven ground. That's when I heard it. A soft crack, like a branch snapping under heavy weight. I froze listening but heard nothing more. My heart started to race, and I turned the flashlight toward the direction of the sound. There was nothing there, only darkness. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, and decided I should go back inside before I made myself paranoid. I locked the cabin door, though it felt pointless, and sat by the fire trying to calm my racing thoughts. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The wind outside picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the windows. I thought I saw shadows shift in the corners of my vision, but when I looked, the cabin was empty. I tried to read, but I couldn't focus. Every sound outside, the brush moving, a distant animal call, the wind in the trees, made me flinch. I could not shake the sensation that something was out there, waiting, just beyond the edge of the clearing. Around midnight, the real fear began. I was in the kitchen when I heard it. A loud thump against the cabin wall, followed by a scratching sound. It was deliberate, heavy, as though something was testing the structure itself. I froze, listening. The noise continued in irregular intervals, coming from different parts of the cabin. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a bear, but the pattern was too calculated, almost purposeful. My stomach sank. I realized that if it were a bear, it would have clawed the door or smashed a window by now. Something else was out there. I grabbed a flashlight and a heavy cast iron pan from the stove. I forced myself to stand, moving quietly to the front door. I shined the light outside, sweeping the beam across the clearing. The forest stared back at me with empty darkness. I saw no one, no animal, nothing at all. My breath was rapid, fogging in the cold night air. The scratching and thumping noises stopped as suddenly as they had started. I listened for minutes, heart pounding, but heard nothing. I convinced myself I was imagining it, that the isolation and darkness were playing tricks on my mind. I returned to the living area, sitting as close to the fire as possible. Hours passed slowly. Every sound outside made me flinch. At some point, I drifted off to a restless sleep, curled in the bed with the pan next to me, ready to defend myself if necessary. I woke to a faint, almost imperceptible creak in the cabin floor. I sat up, straining to hear. The morning light had begun to creep in through the windows, softening the oppressive darkness. I held my breath, and then I heard it again. Footsteps outside, deliberate, pacing. They were not heavy, not like an animal, and they weren't coming from all over the clearing. They were concentrated right outside the cabin. Panic surged through me. I considered running, but the only way out was through the door that faced the approaching footsteps. I grabbed my keys, the pan, and a flashlight. I pressed my back against the wall, listening. The footsteps stopped. I could hear nothing else, only my own panicked breathing. Then, suddenly, the doorknob rattled. A soft twist, a pause, another twist. I realized I had been locked in more than the cabin's isolation. I was being watched, and someone might try to enter. I remembered the cabin owner had mentioned a neighbor a few miles away who occasionally checked in. I grabbed my phone and tried to call, but there was no signal. I ran to the window and tried to look through it, but the fog outside obscured everything. I knew I had to leave, had to get help, but stepping outside could be dangerous if someone was out there. My heart raced uncontrollably as I tried to think clearly. I decided on a plan. I would wait until the owner's neighbor arrived, or until I saw clear evidence that no one was there. I barricaded the door with the heavy table and chairs, wedging them under the doorknob. I moved to the back window and checked for any other exits. The small cabin porch was elevated a few feet, with no other doors or openings. My mind raced through every scenario, imagining what could happen if someone forced their way in. Hours passed. The footsteps never returned. The fog lifted slightly with the rising sun, revealing the forest around the cabin. I gathered my courage and stepped outside cautiously, scanning the clearing. Everything appeared normal. Trees, scattered rocks, fallen leaves. Nothing suggested anyone had been here overnight except for me. My relief was tempered by exhaustion and lingering fear. I walked around the perimeter, looking for signs, but found nothing. No footprints, no disturbances, no indication of human presence. I decided I had to leave immediately. I packed my belongings as quickly as possible, constantly glancing around at the seemingly endless forest. My drive back was tense but uneventful, the road empty. The early morning sunlight helped me feel less anxious, but I could not shake the memory of those footsteps, the rattling doorknob, the sense of being watched in the darkness. I later learned from the cabin owner that the previous renters had reported similar experiences. People occasionally hiked near the area, lost or wandering, and sometimes camped illegally in the forest. It was likely someone had been out there, observing the cabin, but no one had ever broken in. That knowledge was both comforting and unsettling. I realized that fear was a product of isolation and the uncertainty of human behavior. The forest was beautiful, peaceful even, but it was also unpredictable and unforgiving. From that day on, I never returned to the cabin. I had sought solitude and escape, but I found something far more intense: the raw vulnerability of being alone in the wilderness, with the unknown pressing close. I told myself I had survived, that I had faced fear and come through unscathed, but I could still remember the pounding of my heart, the scratching against the walls, and the way the shadows seemed to move with intent. It was a reminder that some places are better admired from a safe distance, and some solitude carries a cost I am not willing to pay again. Even now, years later, when I see dense forests or winding country roads, I remember that night vividly. The isolation, the unknown, the fear that comes not from the supernatural, but from the very real unpredictability of other people and the wilderness. And I understand now that safety is never guaranteed, even in a small, quiet cabin. I had been driving for hours through winding forest roads that seemed endless. The sky had a dull gray tone, and a fine drizzle began falling, making the dirt road slick and muddy. I could see the mist hanging low between the trees, clinging to the moss and the dark trunks like a living thing. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. A chance to get away from the city, away from the noise, from the endless flood of work emails and meaningless errands. The cabin I had rented was supposed to be remote, isolated, a place where I could finally breathe. I parked my car at the edge of a small clearing. The ground was soft from the rain, and my tires had left deep tracks in the mud. I grabbed my bag and walked toward the cabin, which I had seen in pictures online. In real life, it was smaller than I imagined, more rustic, but it had a quiet charm. The wooden walls were dark with age, the roof covered in thick moss, and the windows glinted faintly with moisture. The smell of wet pine and damp earth filled the air. I unlocked the cabin door, and it creaked loudly as it opened. The smell inside was earthy and musty, with a faint hint of smoke, probably from someone having used the fireplace recently. The interior was small but functional. A kitchenette on one side, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a single bed in the corner, and a wood-burning stove that looked like it had seen decades of use. I set my bag down and ran my fingers over the table. Dust had settled in the corners, and a few cobwebs hung along the beams, but the cabin seemed solid and safe. I spent the next hour unpacking and organizing my things. I had brought a lantern, extra batteries, food, water, and blankets. I liked to be prepared. As I moved around, I noticed small details that added to the cabin's charm. Scratches on the floor where furniture had shifted over time, little carvings in the wood along the stair railings, and faded marks on the walls, probably made by past visitors. It was quiet here, but not silent. I could hear the rain pattering on the roof, the occasional creak of the wooden walls, and somewhere outside, a bird call or the rustle of leaves. By late afternoon, the rain had stopped. I decided to take a walk to stretch my legs. The forest was dense, the path barely visible beneath layers of fallen leaves. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and decaying foliage. The light was fading quickly, and shadows grew long among the trees. I followed the trail for about half a mile before realizing I should turn back. As I walked, I kept my eyes peeled for wildlife. A squirrel darted across the path, and a deer moved gracefully between the trees, its white tail flicking. But mostly it was quiet, too quiet, I thought. Returning to the cabin, I noticed something odd. My car keys, which I was sure I had left on the table, were missing. My heart started to beat faster. I checked the floor, the countertops, even the bed, but they were gone. I remembered locking the door when I came in. I must have dropped them outside. My stomach sank as I realized it was getting darker, the forest around the cabin closing in with shadows that seemed to deepen unnaturally. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped back outside. The ground was slick, and my shoes sank slightly in the mud. I scanned the area around the car, the key dangling from my hand as the flashlight cut through the dimming light. First, I saw nothing. Then, just beyond the clearing, I noticed footprints. They were deep, wet impressions in the mud, and they led away from the car toward the trees. My breath caught. These weren't mine. They were larger, heavier, and spaced in a way that suggested a man walking. I took a step forward, then another, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. But the footprints continued past the edge of the clearing and disappeared into the darkness of the forest. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. I ran back to the cabin, locking the door behind me and checking the windows. Everything seemed intact, but the sense of being watched was growing stronger. I tried to calm myself, telling myself I probably just dropped my keys somewhere along the path, that someone else might have been walking in the woods. But the footprints didn't feel random. They felt deliberate. I spent the next hour inspecting the cabin. I checked all the locks, closed the curtains, and piled some firewood near the door. I ate a simple dinner, canned soup and bread, and tried to focus on practical matters. I had my phone, I had food, I had a fireplace I could light for warmth. But as darkness fell completely, the forest outside became a solid wall of black. The wind picked up, rattling the cabin, and I heard the faint crunch of footsteps outside again. Not fast, not hurried, just deliberate steps moving around the cabin perimeter. My heart raced. I went to the window and tried to look outside, but the darkness swallowed everything. My flashlight was useless through the glass. I considered calling the police, but the signal was weak here, barely a single bar. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening. The steps moved slowly, circling the cabin, pausing at intervals as if whoever or whatever was out there, was waiting, watching. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, a bear perhaps, but the rhythm of the footsteps didn't match anything I knew of. They were too heavy, too measured. Hours passed like this. I kept the lights off, only the dim glow of the lantern illuminating the room. I could hear the occasional branch snap outside, leaves rustling, the wind brushing against the walls. My imagination tried to take over, filling in shapes, creating shadows that weren't there. Every small noise made me jump, my heart hammering against my ribs. I considered leaving, but the idea of walking through the forest in complete darkness, barefoot in the mud, was terrifying. I had to wait for daylight. Morning came slowly, a gray and muted light filtering through the rain-soaked trees. I stepped outside carefully, my eyes scanning the clearing. The footprints from last night had not gone anywhere. They ended right at the edge of the cabin. Whoever had been here had left, but not by the obvious path. My car keys were back on the table inside, as if nothing had happened. I knew that was impossible. I hadn't put them there. Despite my fear, I decided to stay another day. I lit the stove, brewed coffee, and tried to occupy myself with small tasks. Cleaning the cabin, organizing supplies, even just looking out the window and trying to enjoy the forest. But the unease lingered. Every sound made me tense. Every shadow seemed to move. I avoided going outside. By late afternoon, I had convinced myself to explore a small stream a few hundred yards from the cabin, reasoning that fresh air and movement might help calm me. I walked slowly along the path, watching the forest carefully. Everything seemed normal. Birds called, the water in the stream bubbled over rocks, and the smell of wet pine and moss was refreshing. But then, I noticed something in the mud along the stream bank. A handprint. Not a human hand, not a bear, but a handprint pressed deeply into the soft soil. The fingers splayed unnaturally wide. I froze. I crouched to examine it, my stomach twisting. The print was fresh, the soil still moist. I looked around. There were no footprints leading to it, no other signs of passage. Just the handprint and the empty forest. I ran back to the cabin, my pulse thrumming in my ears. I double-checked the locks, windows, and doors. Every noise outside made me flinch. I stayed inside for the rest of the day, too afraid to step out. Night came again, darker than before. The wind picked up, rattling the cabin. I heard a scraping sound against the wooden siding. It was soft, deliberate, slow, as if someone or something was testing the strength of the walls. I held my breath, barely daring to move. I spent the night awake, keeping my lantern close, knife in hand, listening. The sounds outside continued intermittently, scraping, shuffling, heavy footfalls, sometimes a low thud. I couldn't sleep, only huddled in a corner, waiting for dawn. When morning finally arrived, gray and dripping with rain, I stepped outside cautiously. The clearing looked untouched, but there were signs that someone had been around. My firewood pile had been moved slightly, one log tipped over. There were no footprints leading to the cabin, no tire tracks, just subtle disturbances in the mud. I packed quickly, leaving as much behind as I could, and got into my car. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the clearing. There was no one. I never went back to that cabin, but I never forgot the feeling of being watched, the slow, deliberate footsteps, and the handprint in the mud. For weeks after, I double-checked locks, windows, even when I was in my own apartment. I realized how fragile the sense of safety could be, how quickly isolation could turn a peaceful weekend into something dangerous. The experience changed how I viewed being alone, especially in remote places. I learned to respect the quiet, to prepare meticulously, and most importantly, to trust my instincts when something feels wrong. Eventually, I moved on, returned to city life, but the memory stayed vivid. I know now that isolation can make small things terrifying, that human presence, or the suggestion of it, can haunt a place without ever being seen directly. The forest was indifferent, but I felt eyes everywhere, even if no one was really there. And though I managed to leave safely, I realized that sometimes survival is just about paying attention, acting cautiously, and leaving when something feels wrong. I survived that cabin because I stayed alert, because I didn't let fear paralyze me into foolishness. And that knowledge, that awareness, became a permanent part of me, shaping every future decision about being alone in the wilderness. Even years later, I still think about that cabin whenever I drive through forests or hear footsteps behind me in the dark. It is not a story of ghosts or legends. It is a story of careful observation, human caution, and the eerie, unexplainable feeling of being watched in a place that should be safe. That weekend taught me to respect the quiet, to understand how unpredictable isolation can be, and how even a small, simple cabin in the woods can turn into a place of real, tangible fear. I had been planning this trip for months, maybe longer than I realized. I wanted to be alone, to escape everything. People, phones, the constant noise of the city, the endless pressure of work and obligations. I wanted a place so isolated that if anything happened, no one could reach me, no one could help me. The cabin I rented was perfect for that. Nestled deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest road, it promised complete solitude. I had studied maps and reviews, looked at pictures, and read every detail the owner had posted online. It was a simple wooden structure, a single story with a small loft, a fireplace, and a well for water. The photos made it look cozy, inviting even. I packed lightly but carefully, food for a week, water, blankets, my camera, a few books, and a small first aid kit. I didn't want to rely on electricity, so I brought lanterns and batteries. I thought I was ready for anything. The drive there was long, far longer than I expected. I passed through winding roads, dirt tracks, and thick forests. The last 10 miles were rough, the road barely a trail, overgrown and uneven. My car bounced and jolted, but I was too excited to care. When I finally saw the cabin through the trees, it looked exactly like the pictures. Quiet, alone, untouched. I parked and got out, feeling a strange mix of relief and tension. The air smelled different here, cleaner, heavier with pine and earth. Birds called in the distance, but otherwise, there was no sound. I unloaded my things slowly, making sure everything was secure. The cabin's interior was exactly as it appeared online, rustic but functional. Wooden floors, a small kitchen area with basic utensils, a fireplace with stacked wood, and a loft above. I spent the first hour unpacking, placing things where they would be easy to reach. I checked the windows and doors. Everything was solid, nothing seemed out of place. I lit a lantern and sat in the corner with a cup of coffee, taking in the silence. It was so deep that I could hear my own breathing and the slight creaking of the cabin settling. For the first time in months, I felt completely alone. And at that moment, it was exactly what I wanted. The first day passed without incident. I explored the nearby surroundings carefully, marking the boundaries of the property in my mind. There was a small stream behind the cabin, some flat areas to sit and read, and dense woods that stretched far beyond what I could see. I noted the locations of the nearest potential hazards: a fallen tree blocking a path, a steep slope that could be dangerous, some uneven ground. Everything seemed normal, quiet, peaceful. Night fell quickly, darker than I expected. I had brought several lanterns, but I left one outside on the porch for emergencies. The stars were incredible, thousands of tiny points of light in the black sky. I lay on the floor with a blanket, staring up at the loft ceiling, feeling the tension in my body melt away. But just as I was drifting to sleep, I heard something, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, coming from outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe an animal moving through the brush. I stayed still, listening. There it was again, a faint crunching of leaves, a step on the dirt. I froze. I told myself it was probably nothing, just a deer, or some other forest animal. But the sound was deliberate, moving closer to the cabin. I could hear it approaching the back door. I grabbed a flashlight and peered out the window. Nothing. Only the dark shapes of trees and shadows. I waited, straining my ears. The sound stopped. My heartbeat sped up. I considered going outside to check, but every instinct in me screamed not to. I stayed by the window, shining the flashlight around. The beam caught something, a movement behind a tree, just at the edge of the yard. I blinked. The shape disappeared. My mind raced. I thought about calling someone, but the cell service was spotty, barely enough to send a text, and even then, it might not go through. I had brought a satellite phone for emergencies, but I hadn't even thought I would need it for something like this. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening, watching. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made my pulse spike. I didn't sleep well at all. Morning came slowly, with an uneasy light creeping through the windows. I made coffee, ate something, and tried to calm myself. In the daylight, everything looked harmless again. The woods seemed friendly, the cabin safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Over the next couple of days, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I noticed small things at first. Footprints near the back door that I didn't recognize. Small branches broken in ways I hadn't left them. Once, I found a small piece of cloth snagged on a bush, torn, frayed. I told myself it was probably animals, hikers, someone else camping nearby. But the truth was, the cabin was so remote, it didn't make sense for anyone to be around without my knowledge. I tried to rationalize it. I double-checked the locks, reinforced the windows with extra wood, and kept a lantern and a heavy flashlight nearby at all times. I even moved the furniture slightly to block the windows that faced the back. One evening, around dusk, I was preparing dinner when I heard it again. A sound that froze me in place. Someone was walking around the cabin, circling it. Slow, deliberate steps. I could hear them crunching the leaves, moving from one side to the other. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the front door, shining the light into the trees. Nothing. But then I realized something. The back door was slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. I decided to lock the door again, but I noticed something else. A line of footprints leading away from the cabin into the woods. They were fresh, deep, unmistakable. Whoever had been here had left recently. I didn't know if they were still nearby. I checked my supplies, making sure nothing was missing. Everything seemed in place, but the sense of vulnerability lingered. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the fire, lanterns around me, flashlight in hand, listening to every sound. The wind blew through the trees, making branches scrape against the cabin. Every shadow seemed to move with a life of its own. The next day, I decided to go for a walk to calm my mind. I needed to clear my head, see the surroundings, maybe find some evidence of who had been there. I took a backpack with water, a knife, and my camera. The forest was dense, the trees thick, the underbrush scratching at my legs. I walked carefully, marking my path so I could return. I didn't see anyone at first. Then, about half a mile from the cabin, I saw a small campsite, burnt-out fire, empty cans, a torn backpack. Someone had been here recently. My heart sank, confirmed my worst fear. I wasn't imagining things. Someone had been close, maybe even watching me. I hurried back to the cabin, my mind racing. I considered leaving immediately, driving back to town, going to the nearest ranger station. But the road was rough, and night was approaching. I needed to secure the cabin first. I reinforced the doors and windows even more, stacking firewood to block the back entrance. I found some rope and tied it around the doorknob and a heavy table, creating a makeshift barricade. I even placed some broken branches and rocks around the perimeter as an early warning system. I was paranoid, but I couldn't shake the fear that someone could appear at any moment. That night was the worst. The footsteps returned, circling the cabin, slow, heavy, deliberate. I could hear breathing at times, faint but real. I stayed in the loft, flashlight in hand, watching the windows. I didn't sleep. I barely ate. Every sound made me jump. I imagined all the ways someone could get in, all the scenarios I had never prepared for. The isolation that had seemed so peaceful just days ago now felt like a trap. I realized how vulnerable I was, how little I could do if someone with bad intentions decided to act. The following morning, I decided to take action. I packed what I could carry, including the essentials: water, some food, my backpack, first aid kit, and my camera. I left the cabin as clean as I could, leaving no sign I had been there beyond my tracks, which I hoped would be hard to follow. I didn't take the time to make breakfast. I didn't linger. I left a note on the table in case someone found the cabin, just in case. It was a precaution, but also a way to mark my presence, my existence. I followed the path back to the main road, staying alert, checking behind me every few minutes. I kept my knife in hand, flashlight ready, ears straining for any sound. The forest seemed normal, calm, almost serene, but I knew better. I kept moving, slower than I wanted, but careful. Hours passed before I reached the road, dusty and rough but solid. I didn't see anyone. I finally saw a car approaching in the distance, and I ran toward it, waving my arms. The driver stopped, an older man, and I climbed in without hesitation. I explained as best as I could, breathless and shaking. He didn't ask many questions. He just nodded, understanding the fear in my eyes. He drove me back to town, where I contacted the authorities. They took my statement seriously, but there wasn't much they could do. The area was so remote. Tracking someone through dense forest was nearly impossible. But they gave me a few tips, reassured me, and told me to stay somewhere safe for the night. I agreed immediately. I never returned to the cabin. I sold the property rental, told the owner I had an emergency, and never looked back. The experience stayed with me for months, haunting me in quiet moments. I realized how fragile safety can be, how quickly peace can turn into terror, how easily someone can invade your solitude. But I also realized something else. I survived. I acted, I stayed alert, I trusted my instincts. I took the necessary steps to protect myself, and in the end, I made it out. I was alive. That clarity, that understanding became the most important part of the experience. The fear never fully left me, but it taught me vigilance, awareness, and the importance of preparation. Years later, I still think about that cabin, the footsteps, the sense of being watched. I replay every detail in my mind. The texture of the wood, the smell of the forest, the sound of leaves underfoot. But I also remember the relief of reaching safety, the feeling of sunlight on my face after leaving the forest behind, the sound of a normal road beneath my tires. It was a terrifying experience, one I wouldn't wish on anyone, but it was real, and it was survivable. And in the end, that is what matters most. I never thought a weekend in a cabin could turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I had been looking forward to this trip for months, imagining it as a peaceful retreat far away from the city's noise, where I could read, hike, and simply be alone with nature. I had found a small cabin online, off the beaten path, and the pictures made it look perfect. The cabin was surrounded by thick pine forests, with a small stream nearby, and the description promised complete privacy. I had driven for hours to get there, leaving the main roads behind and taking smaller and smaller dirt paths until eventually, the car shook over rocks and potholes that looked like they hadn't been repaired in decades. By the time I saw the cabin, isolated among the tall trees, I felt a sense of excitement mixed with relief that I had finally arrived. The cabin itself was small, maybe just a single room with a loft above, but it was sturdy and looked well kept. The windows had curtains, the door had a lock that still worked smoothly, and there was a small porch with a rocking chair. I parked my car nearby, unloaded my backpack and supplies, and immediately felt that satisfying mix of freedom and solitude. For the first few hours, everything seemed perfect. I unpacked, set up my sleeping area in the loft, and took a long walk around the cabin to stretch my legs after the long drive. The air was crisp, the smell of pine and wet earth calming, and the stream was small but clear, running over stones with a gentle bubbling sound. I felt like I had stepped into another world entirely. As the sun started to set, I built a small fire outside the cabin. I had brought firewood that was stacked under the porch, along with kindling and matches. The crackling flames gave a comforting warmth as the sky darkened. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, enjoying the solitude, the quiet, and the faint rustle of wind in the trees. I noticed, as I often do when I am alone in the woods, That sound seemed sharper here. Each snap of a branch or shift of leaves made me pause, but I told myself it was nothing but small animals, squirrels, or deer. There was no real danger, just nature being itself. Night fell fully, and the darkness in the forest became complete. My only light came from the fire, which I kept burning as long as I could. Eventually, I went inside the cabin, feeling the comforting creak of the wooden floor beneath my feet. The loft was small but comfortable, with a thin mattress, blankets, and a sleeping bag I had brought. I had brought a small lantern and some candles in case the cabin's electricity, which worked off a generator, failed. I set the lantern on a small table and read a few chapters of a book before deciding to sleep. The cabin was quiet and I felt entirely safe, or so I thought. I had barely closed my eyes when I heard a sound outside. At first, it was subtle, almost like a footstep on the dry leaves or dirt. But in the silence of the forest, it was loud enough to make me tense. I froze, listening carefully. There it was again. A soft, deliberate sound of someone or something moving just beyond the tree line. My heart rate increased. I reminded myself that this was probably an animal. Deer maybe, even raccoons. But the sound repeated, slow and steady, as if someone was walking around the cabin. I strained my eyes in the dark, but the forest was dense, and the shadows between the trees swallowed any figure completely. The fire had burned low, and the soft glow barely reached the treeline. I checked the doors and windows. Everything was locked. I had brought a small knife for emergencies, which now I gripped tightly, though the thought of using it made my stomach turn. The sound continued, circling the cabin at intervals, and then there was a sudden louder noise, like a heavy branch snapping under weight. My first instinct was to tell myself it was a falling branch, but something about the pattern of movement felt intentional, not random. Whoever or whatever was outside was moving deliberately, as if checking all sides of the cabin. I sat there for what felt like hours, listening. The sound would stop, then start again. Occasionally, I would catch glimpses of something moving between the trees, just out of clear sight. Every time my eyes caught movement, my chest tightened. I kept thinking about my car, parked only a short distance away. If someone had approached it, I would see footprints or marks, but the moonlight, though faint, didn't reveal anything obvious. Still, the feeling of being watched settled into the pit of my stomach. I eventually forced myself to try to sleep, telling myself that morning light would bring clarity and safety. I lay awake, barely daring to breathe, as the occasional snap of twigs outside punctuated the otherwise still night. Somewhere around 3 a.m., I heard it clearly, footsteps on the porch. Not just near the cabin, but actually on the wooden porch, deliberate and measured. My heart leapt into my throat. I grabbed my knife and slowly crept to the edge of the loft, peering over. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the dying embers of the fire. I could see a shadow moving across the porch, but it was too dark to make out clearly. Whoever it was, they had reached the door and were trying to manipulate the lock. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to think logically. The cabin door had two locks. The main lock, which the intruder was trying to force, was reinforced. The secondary latch, which I had bolted, would prevent entry even if the main lock gave way. I waited, heart hammering, as the shadow moved back and forth, testing the door. Then came a sound that made me feel cold. A low scraping noise, as if someone was trying to pry the door open with a tool. I realized quickly that calling for help would not work. There was no cell service out here. My only option was to wait for daylight or hope that the intruder gave up. But I knew from experience that some people were stubborn, and if they were determined, I could be trapped inside all night. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it through a small gap in the loft railing. The beam caught the intruder by surprise. I saw a man crouched near the door, a hood covering his face, a crowbar in hand. He froze, then bolted into the trees when the light hit him. I didn't wait to see where he went. I stayed in the loft until I felt certain he had disappeared. I could hear him moving away, crunching through the leaves, but eventually the sounds faded. I kept the flashlight with me, checking all doors and windows again, and fortified the cabin as much as I could. I moved furniture in front of the main door and kept the knife within reach. Sleep was impossible, but I stayed awake, vigilant, listening for any sign of him returning. Morning brought relief but not safety. I had to leave the cabin. I packed my essentials quickly, not daring to waste a moment, and decided to walk to the nearest main road. My car, parked close to the cabin, now seemed like a dangerous target. I was alert, constantly scanning the trees, expecting the intruder to appear again. The forest that had seemed peaceful the day before now felt hostile, each tree a potential hiding place. Every sound made me jump. Birds taking off in a sudden rush, the rustle of small animals. All of it seemed amplified in my heightened state of fear. I made it to the dirt road after an hour of tense walking, constantly checking behind me. When I finally reached a section where I could see signs of human activity, tire tracks, a mailbox at the edge of a driveway, I felt a surge of relief. I began waving at every passing car, signaling desperately for help. Finally, a pickup truck slowed, and the driver, seeing my state, stopped. I explained briefly that someone had tried to break into my cabin, and he offered to drive me to the nearest town and police station. By the time I reached town, I was exhausted, shaking, and unable to fully comprehend what had happened. I filed a report, gave a description of the intruder, and learned that this area had seen a few incidents recently of burglars targeting isolated cabins. Apparently, some criminals would scout these areas during the day and strike at night, counting on people being alone and far from help. The reality of it hit me hard. I had been lucky. If the intruder had been determined or armed differently, the night could have ended much worse. The police advised me to leave the area and avoid the cabin until the investigation concluded. I returned home, grateful for the safety of city life, but unable to forget that night. Even weeks later, I replayed every sound, every shadow, every movement in the forest. I realized how quickly comfort and peace can turn into terror when you are isolated and vulnerable. I learned the importance of preparation, awareness, and the limits of solitude in the wild. I never returned to that cabin. I stopped seeking isolated retreats for a long time. But I also learned something about myself. I had survived not because of luck alone, but because I stayed calm, thought logically under extreme stress, and acted carefully. I fortified my sense of caution and vigilance from that point onward. The memory of that night, and the shadow moving across the porch under the dying firelight, stayed with me. It was terrifying, yes, but it was real, and I had made it through stronger and more aware. I knew now that nature was peaceful, but people, strangers, could bring true danger, even in the most serene places. From then on, any trip I took into the wilderness, I planned meticulously, checked communications, carried proper tools, and always made sure I was never truly alone in a place where help could be hours away. That experience in the cabin changed me forever, making me cautious, alert, and appreciative of safety. And it left me with a respect for the thin line between solitude and vulnerability that no amount of preparation can fully erase.